The candles had barely finished burning when Elena Voss felt the first drop of cold sweat slide down her spine. The great hall of Blackthorn stood packed with wolves from every corner of the Northern Territory, all of them watching her walk toward the man who ruled them. Damien Ashgrove waited at the altar, tall and steady, his golden eyes fixed on her as if she were the only person in the room. She should have felt joy. Instead, her heart pounded with a fear she could not explain, a fear that had followed her since the night before, when she found a folded letter tucked beneath her pillow with no name attached to it. The letter had said only one line: ask him what happened to his mother, and ask him before you say yes. Elena had read it 3 times, her hands trembling, before she burned it in the fireplace of her chamber. She told herself it was nothing, some cruel prank meant to rattle her nerves before the biggest day of her life. But the words had lodged themselves in her mind like a splinter, and no matter how many times she tried to shake them loose, they stayed there, pulsing with a quiet dread. Now, standing halfway down the aisle, she looked at Damien and tried to remember why she loved him. It was not hard to remember. He had been patient with her when she first arrived at Blackthorn, an outsider with no pack of her own, taken in after her family was lost in a raid many years ago. He had never once made her feel like a stranger. He had made her feel like she belonged, like she was meant to stand beside him, and for 2 years she had believed that with her whole heart. But belief was a fragile thing, and the letter had cracked it. The maid of honor, a young woman named Priya, gave her a gentle nudge from behind, urging her forward. Elena forced her feet to move, one step and then another, her white dress trailing over the stone floor. She caught sight of Damien's beta, a broad-shouldered man named Roran, standing near the front row with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. Something about the way he watched her made the hair on her arms rise. She had always found Roran distant, even cold, but tonight, there was something sharper in his gaze, something that felt like a warning. She reached the altar. Damien took her hands in his, and for a moment, the fear eased. His grip was warm and familiar, the same hands that had held hers through storms and losses and quiet nights by the fire. The priestess began to speak the opening words of the ceremony, her voice carrying through the silent hall, and Elena tried to focus on the sound, instead of the questions clawing at the back of her mind. Ask him what happened to his mother. She had never asked. In 2 years, she had never once brought up the subject of Damien's mother, because she had learned early on that it was a wound too deep to touch. The former queen of Blackthorn had died when Damien was young, and the official story was simple. She had fallen ill during a harsh winter and passed before the pack healers could save her. Elena had accepted that story the way she accepted most things about Damien's past, without question, because questioning felt like prying into pain that was not hers to touch. But now, with the priestess asking her to repeat her vows, with the whole pack watching and waiting, she found she could not push the letter's words away. Her mouth went dry. Her fingers, still wrapped in Damien's, began to tremble. Elena, the priestess said gently, please repeat after me. Elena opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Damien squeezed her hands, his brow furrowing with concern. Elena, he whispered, low enough that only she could hear, are you all right? She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but love and worry there, no trace of guilt, no flicker of a secret being hidden. And yet the letter's warning rang through her mind louder than ever, and beneath it, a second thought rose up, cold and clear. If something happened to his mother that was never explained, then someone in this pack knows the truth, and that same someone left the letter under my pillow. Someone wanted her to know. Someone wanted her to ask. I need air, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's grip tightened, not from anger, but from surprise. Elena, what's wrong? Talk to me. I just need a moment, she said, forcing a small smile that felt like glass on her face, wetting nerves. I'll be right back. She slipped her hands free before he could argue, and turned toward the side door of the hall, the one that led out to the private garden behind the estate. She heard murmurs ripple through the crowd, hushed and confused, but she kept walking, her steps quickening with every stride, until she pushed through the door and out into the cool night air. The garden was empty and dark, lit only by strings of lanterns hung between the trees for the celebration that was supposed to follow the ceremony. Elena pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing, trying to convince herself that she was overreacting, to a note that could have been written by anyone, with a grudge against her, or against Damien. That was when she heard the voice. "You read the letter." Elena spun around. A figure stood in the shadow of the garden wall, hooded and still. She could not make out a face, only the shape of someone tall, someone who had clearly been waiting for her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her wolf senses sharpening, the fine hairs on her neck rising as adrenaline flooded her veins. "Someone who knows what really happened to the old queen," the figure said, "and someone who knows that if you marry him tonight, you will never be safe again." "That's not an answer," Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even as her pulse roared in her ears. "Tell me who you are." The figure took a step back into deeper shadow. "There isn't time. They will notice you're gone soon. If you want the truth, meet me at the old mill, by the river at midnight. Come alone. Tell no one, especially not him." "Why should I trust you?" Elena asked. "You could be trying to hurt me." "If I wanted to hurt you," the voice said, quiet and firm, "I would not be warning you to run." Before Elena could respond, the figure turned and disappeared through a gap in the garden wall, moving with the kind of speed that only a wolf could manage. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, her thoughts spinning in circles. Somewhere behind her, inside the hall, she could hear Damien's voice calling her name, followed by footsteps approaching the garden door. She had only seconds to decide. If she went back inside, she would marry a man she loved without ever knowing the truth about the letter, the queen, or the stranger who claimed her life would be in danger. If she ran, she would humiliate him in front of the entire pack, break a promise she had made with her whole heart, and step into a night full of unknowns, with no one to protect her. But something about the stranger's warning had struck a nerve she could not ignore, a fear that had been building quietly for weeks, small details she had brushed aside until now. The way certain elders went silent whenever the old queen's name came up. The way Roran watched her with something close to suspicion whenever she asked innocent questions about Damien's childhood. The way Damien himself would change the subject, gently but firmly, any time the past threatened to surface. She thought of the folded letter burning in her fireplace and the words that refused to leave her mind. "Ask him before you say yes." She had not asked, and now, standing in the dark garden with her wedding gown catching on the wind, she realized she might never get another chance. The door behind her creaked open. Damien stepped out into the garden, his tuxedo slightly rumpled from where he had loosened his collar in his hurry to follow her. His eyes searched the darkness and found her standing near the garden wall, and the relief on his face was immediate and real. "There you are," he said, walking toward her. "You scared me half to death. Are you feeling ill? We can pause the ceremony if you need more time." Elena looked at him, at the man she had planned to spend her life with, and felt her heart break just a little. "Damien," she said carefully, "can I ask you something? About your mother?" His expression shifted instantly, the warmth in his eyes dimming into something guarded. It was subtle, barely there, but Elena had spent 2 years learning every flicker of emotion on his face, and she saw it clearly now. A wall going up, a door closing. "Why would you ask about that tonight, of all nights?" he said, his voice gentle but strained. "Because I need to know the truth," Elena said. "Please, just tell me what really happened to her." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his gaze drifting somewhere past her shoulder, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps searching for a way to avoid them altogether. "She got sick," he finally said. "The winter was hard. The healers couldn't save her. That's what happened." "Is that the truth?" Elena asked softly. "Or is that just the story everyone agreed to tell?" His eyes snapped back to hers, sharp with something that might have been surprise, or might have been alarm. "Where is this coming from, Elena?" Before she could answer, a horn sounded from somewhere near the front gates of the estate, low and urgent, the kind of sound reserved only for emergencies. Damien's head turned sharply toward the noise, his shoulders squaring with instinct. "Stay here," he said. "I need to see what that is." He moved quickly toward the front of the estate, leaving Elena alone in the garden once more, her heart still hammering, her mind still spinning with unanswered questions. She looked toward the gap in the garden wall where the stranger had vanished, then toward the hall, where hundreds of guests waited for a wedding that had stalled without explanation. Midnight was still hours away. She had time to think, time to decide, Time to weigh loyalty against the growing certainty that something dark was buried beneath the foundation of the life she had built with Damien. But as she stood there, alone beneath the lantern light, she felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her that she could no longer avoid. She could stay, marry the man she loved, and bury the questions, along with whatever secret his mother had taken to her grave. Or she could walk away from everything she knew, chase the truth into the dark, and risk losing him forever. She thought of the stranger's final words. "If you want the truth, meet me at the old mill by the river at midnight." Her decision came faster than she expected, driven not by doubt in Damien's heart, but by a desperate need to protect whatever future they might have together. If there was a secret buried in his past, a secret dangerous enough that someone risked everything to warn her, then she needed to uncover it before it could destroy them both. She glanced once more toward the hall, toward the life she was choosing to leave behind for now, and then she slipped through the gap in the garden wall and disappeared into the night, her wedding gown catching on the branches as she ran, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure. Behind her, the horn sounded again, louder this time, and shouts began to rise from the front of the estate. Something was happening at Blackthorn, something urgent enough to pull Damien away from his own wedding, and Elena did not know if it was connected to the stranger's warning or if it was simply terrible timing. All she knew was that she was running out of time, and the truth was waiting for her somewhere in the darkness, beyond the borders of everything familiar. She ran until the lights of Blackthorn faded behind her, until the only sound left was her own breathing and the distant rush of the river ahead, and she did not look back. The forest path narrowed as she moved deeper away from the estate, brambles catching at the delicate fabric of her gown, tearing small holes near the hem. She barely noticed. Her mind was fixed entirely on the stranger's words, replaying them over and over, as if repetition might reveal some hidden meaning she had missed the first time. Someone who knows what really happened to the old queen. She had grown up hearing whispers about the old queen, fragments of stories that never quite fit together. Some of the older wolves spoke of her with a reverence bordering on sorrow, as though her death had left a wound on the entire pack that never fully healed. Others avoided the subject entirely, changing topics with a swiftness that Elena had always found strange but never questioned. Now she wondered how much of that silence had been grief, and how much of it had been fear. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and Elena froze, her senses sharpening instantly. She turned, scanning the darkness between the trees, but saw nothing except shifting shadows and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the canopy above. She told herself it was probably a rabbit or a bird startled from its nest, but her heart continued to race, refusing to settle. She kept moving, slower now, more careful with each step, aware that the safety of the estate was shrinking further behind her with every passing minute. The horn had sounded twice before she left, and she wondered again what emergency had called Damien away so suddenly. Perhaps it had nothing to do with her at all. Perhaps it was simply the cruel timing of two crises converging on the same night. Or perhaps, a small voice in the back of her mind suggested, it was connected, another piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. The river came into view ahead, its dark water catching slivers of moonlight as it wound its way through the valley below Blackthorn's territory. The old mill stood on the near bank, its wooden structure weathered by decades of wind and rain, long abandoned since the pack built newer facilities closer to the estate. Elena had passed it a handful of times during walks with Damien, always in daylight, always with him beside her. Standing before it alone in the dark felt entirely different, the building looming larger and more ominous than she remembered. She checked the position of the moon, guessing that midnight was still at least an hour away. She found a fallen log near the tree line, close enough to the mill to watch for the stranger's arrival but far enough to retreat quickly if something felt wrong. She sat down, pulling her knees close, suddenly aware of how cold the night air felt against her bare arms, how exposed she was without a cloak or weapon of any kind. She thought of Damien's face when she asked about his mother, the way his expression had shifted so quickly from warmth to guarded distance. She did not believe he was capable of hurting anyone, especially not someone he loved, but she also knew that secrets had a way of surviving inside good people, protected not out of malice but out of fear, and fear could make even the kindest person choose silence over truth. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint howl of a wolf, long and mournful, echoing across the valley. She could not tell if it came from Blackthorn's search parties or from somewhere else entirely, and the uncertainty made her stomach twist with unease. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest and waited, watching the mill, watching the tree line, watching the slow crawl of the moon across the sky, unaware that the answers she sought would bring her further from safety than she could have possibly imagined. Back at Blackthorn, chaos had already taken hold of the Great Hall. Damien stood near the front gates with his second in command, a sturdy woman named Ivy, listening to a breathless scout report that a group of unfamiliar wolves had been spotted along the eastern border, close enough to Blackthorn territory to trigger the warning horn. The scout insisted the intruders had retreated before any confrontation occurred, vanishing back across the border as quickly as they had appeared. Damien ordered extra patrols along the perimeter, his mind only half focused on the threat, the other half still lingering on Elena's strange behavior in the garden. When he returned to the hall to find her, she was gone. At first, he assumed she had simply stepped away to compose herself, perhaps overwhelmed by the excitement of the ceremony, combined with the sudden alarm at the gates. He waited by the altar, 10 minutes, then 20, his patience wearing thin as murmurs spread through the crowd of guests. Priya approached him with a worried expression, admitting that she had not seen Elena since she slipped out to the garden and never returned. Damien's stomach dropped. He moved through the estate with mounting urgency, checking her chamber, the kitchens, the stables, every corner of Blackthorn where she might have retreated to gather her thoughts. Nothing. No sign of her anywhere. He returned to the garden where he had last spoken with her, and knelt down near the gap in the stone wall, his heightened senses picking up the faint but unmistakable trace of her scent, leading away from the estate. She had run. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest, sharper than any physical wound he had endured in years of leading his pack through conflict and hardship. He could not understand it. Elena had never given him any indication that she doubted their future together. No hesitation in her voice, no distance in her touch, nothing that would explain why she would flee moments before becoming his wife. And then he remembered her question in the garden, the strange urgency in her eyes when she asked about his mother, and a cold suspicion began to take root in his mind. Someone had gotten to her. Someone had planted doubt, or worse, fear, and she had run before he could reassure her. He gathered a small group of his most trusted trackers, including Roran, and set out immediately into the forest, following the fading traces of her scent through the darkness. The trail wound erratically through the trees, suggesting she had moved with haste and little direction, perhaps driven more by panic than by any clear destination. Damien pushed his pace faster, ignoring the ache building in his legs, focused entirely on finding her before whatever danger she might be running from, or running toward, could catch up to her first. Hours passed, the moon climbed higher, and the trail grew fainter, diluted by wind and the passage of time. Damien refused to slow down, driven by a fear more powerful than exhaustion, the fear that something might have already happened to her, that he might be chasing a trail that led only to tragedy. It was Roran who finally called out that the scent was fading entirely near a familiar landmark, the old river that marked the natural boundary between Blackthorn territory and the lands ruled by their oldest rivals, the Ravenswood pack. Damien slowed his pace, his jaw tightening at the mention of the name. Relations between Blackthorn and Ravenswood had been hostile for as long as he could remember, a rivalry stretching back generations, rooted in disputes over territory and resources that had never fully been resolved despite an uneasy peace maintained for the past several years. If Elena's trail led toward Ravenswood land, the implications were troubling. Either she had crossed the border unknowingly in her panic, wandering into dangerous territory without realizing the risk, or someone from Ravenswood had lured her there deliberately, perhaps as a way to strike at Blackthorn through its future queen. Neither possibility offered any comfort. They reached the riverbank as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Damien knelt at the water's edge, searching for any sign of where Elena might have crossed, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. The old mill stood silent on the opposite bank, its weathered boards catching the pale morning light, and something about its stillness sent an uneasy chill down his spine. "Her scent stops here," Roran said quietly, kneeling beside him and examining the muddy bank. "But look, there are other tracks. Multiple wolves, moving in formation, not scattered like a chase. This wasn't random." Damien's blood ran cold. "You're saying she was taken?" "I'm saying it's possible," Roran replied carefully. "Or she met someone here willingly. Either way, These tracks lead directly toward Ravenswood territory. The accusation hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken but obvious. If Ravenswood wolves had crossed the border to retrieve Elena, whether by force or by her own choice, it represented a serious violation of the fragile peace between the two packs, one that could easily reignite old hostilities that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Damien rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the far side of the river, on the dense tree line that marked the beginning of enemy territory. Every instinct in him screamed to cross the border immediately, to tear through Ravenswood land until he found Elena and brought her home safely. But he knew that acting rashly could plunge both packs into a conflict neither could easily recover from, a war built on assumptions rather than confirmed facts. "We need more information before we act," he said, forcing calm into his voice, despite the storm raging inside him. "Send scouts along the border, quietly, without crossing. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before I decide how to respond." Roran nodded, though something in his expression suggested he was already forming his own conclusions about what might have happened, conclusions he chose not to voice aloud in that moment. Damien noticed the hesitation but said nothing, his focus entirely consumed by the growing fear that Elena might be in the hands of people who wished Blackthorn harm. As the sun rose fully over the valley, casting long shadows across the water, Damien stood at the border of the only territory that had ever felt like a threat to everything he had built, staring into land he had avoided for years, and made a silent vow that no rivalry, no old grudge, and no political consequence would stop him from bringing Elena home, whatever it took, and whoever stood in his way. Meanwhile, deep within Ravenswood territory, Elena had not crossed the border by choice at all. After waiting at the old mill for nearly an hour with no sign of the stranger returning, she had heard movement in the trees around her, quiet and deliberate, wolves closing in from multiple directions with practiced coordination. She had tried to run, her heart lurching with panic, but the group surrounding her moved too quickly, cutting off every path of escape before she could react. They had not hurt her. That much she registered clearly even through her fear, the wolves keeping careful distance, their movements controlled rather than aggressive, more like an escort than a capture. But when she demanded answers, none of them spoke, simply guiding her forward with quiet insistence, across the river, and deeper into unfamiliar land she recognized immediately as belonging to Ravenswood, the pack Damien had warned her about on more than one occasion, the pack whose name alone carried the weight of old conflict and deep mistrust. Fear gripped her chest as the trees thickened around them, the moonlight growing dimmer beneath the dense canopy. She thought of Damien, of the wedding she had abandoned, of the uncertainty now swallowing her whole, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake chasing a stranger's warning into the heart of enemy territory, a mistake that might cost her far more than the truth she had been so desperate to uncover. The group moving her deeper into the territory said nothing for most of the journey, their silence unnerving, in a way that felt almost more threatening than open hostility would have been. Elena studied them as best she could without drawing attention, noting the discipline in their formation, the way they positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at escape, without ever raising a hand against her. Whoever had ordered this operation clearly wanted her alive and unharmed, which offered a small measure of comfort, even as the uncertainty of her situation continued to gnaw at her. She thought about calling out, demanding to know where they were taking her, but something told her that questions would only be answered when her captors decided the time was right, not a moment before. So she walked in silence, her wedding gown now streaked with mud and torn along the edges, her bare feet aching from the rough terrain, her mind racing through every possible explanation for why Ravenswood wolves had been waiting near the old mill, at exactly the hour the stranger had told her to arrive. Had the stranger been working for Ravenswood all along? Had the letter under her pillow been part of some elaborate scheme, designed to lure her away from Blackthorn and into the hands of Damien's enemies? The thought made her chest tighten with a fresh wave of fear, not only for herself, but for what such a scheme might mean for the fragile peace between the two packs. If Ravenswood had orchestrated her disappearance to provoke Damien into a war, then she had walked directly into a trap with her eyes wide open, driven by nothing more than curiosity and a desperate need for truth. But another part of her mind resisted that explanation, unable to reconcile the careful, almost protective manner in which the wolves guided her forward with the idea that she was merely a pawn in a scheme to start a war. If Ravenswood wanted conflict, There were far simpler and more brutal ways to achieve it than escorting her quietly through the forest, without so much as raising their voices. As dawn broke fully over the valley, the trees began to thin, revealing the outline of a settlement built into the hillside ahead. Structures made of dark stone and timber that reminded her somewhat of Blackthorn's own estate, though smaller and more fortified, surrounded by a wall that spoke of a pack accustomed to defending itself. Elena felt her pulse quicken as they approached the gates, guards atop the wall watching their arrival with sharp, assessing eyes. The group led her through the gates and into a courtyard where a man stood waiting, his posture radiating quiet authority despite his relatively young age, his dark hair pulled back from a face marked by a thin scar along one cheek. Elena recognized immediately, without needing to be told, that this was someone of significant standing within the pack, perhaps even its leader. "You must be Elena," the man said, his voice calm and measured, carrying none of the hostility she had braced herself to encounter. "I apologize for the manner of your arrival. It was not meant to frighten you, only to ensure your safety, once we learned you had crossed into contested land alone and unprotected." "Who are you?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she expected, given the exhaustion and fear coursing through her. "Kale," the man replied simply. "I lead this pack. And you, I believe, were meant to be married to Damien Ashgrove tonight, yet here you stand, quite far from Blackthorn, quite far from your wedding." Elena said nothing for a moment, studying his expression for any sign of deceit or malice, finding instead something closer to genuine curiosity, as though her presence in his territory puzzled him as much as it frightened her. "Someone told me to find answers about Damien's mother before I said my vows. I went to the old mill to meet them, and instead, your wolves found me." Something shifted in Kale's expression at the mention of the old queen, a flicker of recognition quickly masked by careful neutrality. "That is an interesting thing to be told on your wedding night," he said carefully. "Tell me, did this stranger give you a name?" "No," Elena admitted. "They kept themselves hidden, but they seemed certain that whatever happened to her was not what everyone believes." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting somewhere distant, as though weighing how much he was willing to share with a stranger from enemy territory, who had wandered so unexpectedly into his hands. "There are things about the old queen's death that were never fully explained," he finally said. "Things my own pack has wondered about for years, though we have never had proof strong enough to bring accusations against Blackthorn without risking further conflict between our people." Elena's heart pounded. "Then you believe she was killed, not by illness?" "I believe," Kale said slowly, "that the story told to Blackthorn's pack, and to the wider region, does not account for certain details that never quite made sense. But belief is not proof, and I have learned the danger of acting on incomplete information, especially where war between our packs is concerned." Elena studied him, searching for any sign of manipulation, any indication that he might be using her presence to further some hidden agenda of his own. But his expression remained steady, careful, the look of a leader accustomed to weighing consequences before speaking, not the look of someone eager to exploit a vulnerable outsider for political gain. "Damien will come looking for me," she said. "He'll think Ravenswood took me by force. This could start exactly the kind of war you're trying to avoid." "I am aware of that risk," Kale replied. "Which is why you will remain here only long enough to recover from your journey, and then we will decide together how best to return you safely, without igniting a conflict neither of our packs can afford. In the meantime, you are welcome to rest, and if you wish, to share more of what led you to that mill in the dark of night, alone and undefended." Elena hesitated, torn between the instinct to trust no one from a pack she had been raised to view as an enemy, and the growing suspicion that the answers she sought might be found here, in territory she never expected to set foot in, offered by a man she had been taught her entire life to fear. As exhaustion finally began to overtake the adrenaline that had carried her through the night, she found herself nodding, accepting Kale's offer of rest, uncertain whether she had stumbled into greater danger, or the first true chance at uncovering a truth that had been buried for far too long. Outside the walls of Ravenswood, the sun climbed higher over the valley, and somewhere beyond the river, Damien's search parties continued to comb the border, unaware that the woman they sought was standing safely, if uncertainly, within the very territory they feared had swallowed her whole. Elena was given a small room within the Ravenswood estate, sparse but clean, with a single window overlooking the courtyard below. A young woman named Fiona brought her a change of clothes, simple but warm, along with a plate of food she barely touched, her stomach too tangled with nerves to accept much nourishment. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed her mind to drift back to the days before the wedding, searching for any detail she might have overlooked, any sign that could explain how she had ended up here, in the heart of territory she had been raised to fear. It had started 3 weeks earlier, during a quiet afternoon, when Elena had been sorting through old records in the Blackthorn archive, a task she had taken on herself, after noticing how disorganized the pack's historical documents had become over the years. She enjoyed the work, finding a strange comfort in piecing together fragments of the past, learning about the pack she had come to call home through the yellowed pages of old ledgers and letters. She had come across a locked drawer tucked beneath a shelf of outdated treaties, its key missing, its contents unknown even to the archivist who had worked there for over a decade. Curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she had spent an evening carefully working the old lock open with a hairpin, feeling only mildly guilty about the intrusion, telling herself she was simply preserving history that might otherwise be lost. Inside, she found a small collection of letters, their paper worn soft with age, written in a hand she did not recognize. The letters were addressed to the old queen, Damien's mother, and dated in the months leading up to her death. Elena had read them with growing unease, the tone shifting from formal correspondence in the earliest letters to something far more urgent and fearful in the final few, as though the writer believed their life was in danger, and the queen was somehow connected to that fear. One letter, the last in the collection, contained a single line that had lodged itself permanently in Elena's memory. "If something happens to me, know that it was not an accident, and know that the truth about your own fate may not be far behind mine." Elena had not known what to make of the letter at the time, uncertain whether it referred to some unrelated tragedy or carried a darker warning about the queen's own death, which had occurred not long after the final letter was dated. She had considered showing the letters to Damien, but something held her back, a fear that dredging up his mother's death so close to their wedding would only cause him unnecessary pain over what might turn out to be nothing more than an unrelated coincidence from decades past. Instead, she had quietly continued her research, cross-referencing names and dates within the archive, trying to identify the mysterious letter writer, trying to understand whether the fears expressed in those final desperate lines had any connection to how the old queen actually died. She found fragments, hints, a name that appeared repeatedly in records from that period, a name belonging to someone still very much present within Blackthorn's inner circle. She had not been ready to voice her suspicions aloud, not without more concrete evidence, not without understanding the full picture, before making an accusation that could tear apart the pack she loved, and the man she was about to marry. But then, the night before her wedding, the unsigned letter had appeared beneath her pillow, as if someone had been watching her research all along, someone who wanted her to ask the very questions she had been too afraid to voice herself. Sitting now in a stranger's room within enemy territory, Elena wondered if the person who left that letter had been trying to help her, or if they had been manipulating her toward a confrontation they wanted to see happen, for reasons of their own that had nothing to do with protecting her at all. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Cale entered when she called out permission, his expression still carrying the same careful neutrality she had noted during their first meeting in the courtyard. He took a seat in the simple wooden chair near the window, studying her with quiet patience. "You look troubled," he said. More than exhaustion would explain. Elena considered how much to share, weighing trust against the very real possibility that she was speaking to someone who might use her words against Damien for his own purposes. But something in Cale's manner, steady and unhurried, encouraged her to continue. "I found letters," she said finally, "in the Blackthorn archive, written to the old queen, in the months before she died. The last one warned that her death might not be an accident." Cale's expression sharpened, the careful neutrality slipping just slightly to reveal genuine interest. "Did the letters name anyone specific?" "Not directly," Elena admitted. "But I found a name that kept appearing in records from around that time. Someone still within Blackthorn today." "Who?" Cale asked, leaning forward slightly. Elena hesitated, the weight of the accusation heavy on her tongue. "Roran," she said finally. "Damien's beta. I don't have proof, only a pattern in old records that seems strange to me. I was going to look further before saying anything to Damien, but then the letter appeared under my pillow, warning me to ask him about his mother before the wedding, and everything happened so quickly. Cale sat back, his gaze distant as he processed the information, and Elena saw something flicker across his face that suggested her words had confirmed a suspicion he had long harbored but never been able to prove. "Roran," he repeated quietly. "That name is not unfamiliar to us either. There have been incidents over the years, border disputes that escalated strangely, information that seemed to leak from Blackthorn at convenient moments for certain parties who benefited from continued conflict between our packs. You think Roran has been manipulating things between Blackthorn and Ravenswood," Elena said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind in ways that frightened her. "I think," Cale said carefully, "that someone within Blackthorn has profited from the hostility between our packs for a very long time, and I think that person may have been willing to do far more than simply profit from an existing conflict, if it meant protecting whatever secret lies at the heart of your discovery." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the room. If Roran had been responsible for the old queen's death, and if he had spent years since then manipulating tensions between Blackthorn and Ravenswood to serve his own ambitions, then her disappearance on the night of her wedding, and her subsequent arrival in enemy territory, might play directly into whatever plans he still had in motion, plans that could now be spiraling toward consequences far more dangerous than anyone at Blackthorn currently understood. "Damien doesn't know any of this," she said quietly. "He trusts Roran completely. He's known him since childhood." "Which is exactly why Roran would be the perfect person to hide behind that trust," Cale replied. "If what you suspect is true, Elena, then you may be the only person capable of proving it, and that makes you far more dangerous to him than you realize." The weight of his words settled over her like a physical thing, and for the first time since fleeing Blackthorn, Elena understood clearly that her search for the truth had placed her directly in the path of someone who had already proven himself capable of covering up a murder, and who would likely stop at nothing to ensure that his secret remained buried, even if that meant eliminating anyone who threatened to expose it, including her. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how far she had traveled from the safety of everything familiar in the span of a single night. "What do we do now?" she asked. "I can't stay here forever, and I can't go back to Blackthorn without risking whatever Roran might do, if he learns what I know." Cale considered her question for a long moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the arm of the chair. "For now, you remain here, under my protection, while I send word to Damien that you are safe and unharmed. It will take careful wording to avoid provoking an immediate conflict, given the history between our packs, but I believe he deserves to know the truth, rather than spend days searching blindly, fearing the worst." "He'll think you took me," Elena said. "He already suspects Ravenswood might be involved." "Then we will need to be very clear in how we communicate the truth," Cale replied. "I have no interest in war with Blackthorn, Elena, despite whatever history exists between our packs. If anything, exposing Roran's actions would serve both our interests, removing a source of manipulation that has cost both packs dearly over the years, whether through outright conflict or through the resources wasted maintaining unnecessary hostility." Elena studied him carefully, still uncertain how much to trust a man she had known for less than a day, a man whose pack she had been raised to view with suspicion and fear. But everything he had said aligned logically with what she already knew, and more importantly, nothing in his manner suggested the kind of deception she had learned to recognize in Roran's careful, calculating gaze. "There's something else," she said slowly. "The letters I found, they mentioned that whoever was writing them feared for their own life, not just concern about the queen. If Roran was responsible for her death, he may have silenced the letter writer as well. Finding out who wrote those letters could give us the proof we need, if they're even still alive." Cale's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you remember any other details from the letters? A name, a location, anything that might help identify the writer?" Elena closed her eyes, trying to recall the details clearly, through the fog of exhaustion and fear that had settled over her since fleeing Blackthorn. The handwriting was elegant, careful, like someone educated, someone with access to the queen directly. And there was a phrase repeated in several letters, something about meeting at the same place they always met, though it never specified where that place was. "A confidant then," Cale said. "Someone close enough to the queen to correspond privately and meet with her regularly, someone with enough standing that their fear of retaliation carried weight." He paused, considering. There are a few possibilities among Blackthorn's older generation who might fit that description. Individuals who were close to the royal family during that period and who remain alive today. Who? Elena asked. I would need to think carefully before naming anyone, without more certainty, Cale said. An accusation carries weight, and I have no wish to send you chasing false leads based on speculation alone. But I will consider it, and in the meantime, I suggest you rest. You have had a long night, and tomorrow will require clear thinking if we are to navigate the path ahead safely. Elena nodded, though sleep felt impossibly distant, given the storm of thoughts churning through her mind. Cale rose to leave, pausing at the door for a moment, before turning back to face her. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I believe you did the right thing, coming here rather than ignoring the warning you received. Whatever happens next, that took courage, and courage is not something I take lightly, regardless of which pack it comes from. He left her alone with those words, and Elena sat in the quiet room for a long while afterward, watching the first rays of morning light spread across the courtyard below, wondering how Damien was faring, wondering whether he had begun to suspect the truth about his oldest friend, and wondering whether the fragile trust building between herself and a man from an enemy pack might prove to be her only path toward uncovering justice for a queen who had died with the truth still buried inside her, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to dig it up. Sleep eventually claimed her despite her racing thoughts, exhaustion winning the battle against fear, and when she woke hours later, the sun had climbed high overhead, casting warm light through her small window, though the warmth did little to ease the cold certainty settling in her chest, that the danger surrounding her had only just begun to reveal itself, and that whatever came next would demand more courage than she had ever needed before in her life. Word reached Damien by midday, carried by a lone Ravenswood messenger who approached the Blackthorn border under a flag of truce, her hands raised to show she carried no weapon. Damien met her personally at the edge of his territory, flanked by Ivy and a dozen armed wolves, his patience worn thin after a sleepless night of searching that had yielded nothing but a cold trail and mounting dread. The messenger delivered her words carefully, exactly as instructed. Elena was safe within Ravenswood territory, unharmed, resting under Cale's protection after crossing the border alone during the night. Cale wished to arrange a meeting to discuss her safe return, understanding the sensitivity of the situation and wishing to avoid any misunderstanding that might escalate into conflict between the two packs. Damien listened with his jaw clenched tight, torn between overwhelming relief that Elena was alive and a burning anger that she was being held, whether willingly or not, within territory controlled by wolves he had spent his entire life distrusting. Why would she cross into Ravenswood territory alone, he demanded. What reason would she have to run from her own wedding into land she has been warned about her entire life? The messenger shook her head. I was not given details, only the message I have delivered. Cale requests a meeting at the river crossing, at sundown, to discuss the matter directly and arrange Elena's return. Damien's instinct screamed to gather his forces and march directly into Ravenswood territory, to demand Elena's return through strength rather than negotiation. But years of leading his pack had taught him the cost of acting on instinct alone, especially where the fragile peace between two historically hostile territories was concerned. A wrong move now could shatter years of careful diplomacy, could plunge both packs into a war that would cost countless lives on both sides of the border. Tell Cale I will meet him, Damien said finally, his voice tight with restrained fury. At sundown. And tell him that if any harm has come to her, no amount of diplomacy will save his pack from what follows. The messenger nodded and departed swiftly back toward the border, and Damien turned to Ivy, his expression a mixture of relief and simmering rage that he struggled to keep contained. Gather our strongest fighters, he said. I want them positioned near the border, out of sight, in case this meeting is some kind of trap. You think Cale would risk provoking a war just to lure you into an ambush? Ivy asked carefully. I don't know what to think anymore, Damien admitted. Elena vanished the night before our wedding, after asking me about my mother's death, and now she's somehow found her way into the territory of our oldest enemies. Nothing about this feels random, Ivy. Someone orchestrated this, and I intend to find out who and why before this day is finished. As preparations continued throughout the afternoon, Damien found himself seeking out Roran, hoping his beta's counsel might offer some clarity amid the chaos of the past day. He found him near the training grounds, overseeing a routine drill with a calm efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil Damien felt churning inside himself. "You've heard the news," Damien said, approaching him. "I have," Roran replied, his expression carefully composed. "Ravenswood territory. It's troubling, to say the least. Do you believe Kale is telling the truth about her safety?" "I don't know what to believe," Damien admitted. "She asked me about my mother before she ran, about how she really died. I don't understand why that question would send her fleeing into enemy territory in the middle of the night." Something flickered across Roran's face, quick and controlled, gone almost before Damien registered it. "Strange timing," Roran said carefully. "Perhaps the stress of the wedding brought old grief to the surface. Grief can make people act in ways that seem irrational from the outside." "Perhaps," Damien said, though something about Roran's carefully measured response left an uneasy feeling settling in his chest, a feeling he could not quite name or justify, given how long he had trusted this man as both friend and advisor. The hours crawled by slowly as Damien prepared for the meeting at sundown, his mind circling endlessly around the strange sequence of events that had led him here, standing at the edge of enemy territory, preparing to negotiate the return of the woman he loved, from a man he had spent his entire life viewing as a threat. He tried to focus on the practical matters at hand, the positioning of his fighters, the words he would use to demand Elena's safe return, without triggering a conflict neither pack could afford. But beneath the surface, a quieter, more troubling question continued to nag at him, refusing to be silenced. What if Elena's flight had nothing to do with fear or grief, and everything to do with something she had discovered? Something dangerous enough that she felt compelled to seek answers, even at the risk of crossing into enemy territory alone and unprotected. And if that were true, what exactly had she uncovered that frightened her enough to abandon their wedding entirely? As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long amber light across the valley, Damien gathered his fighters and made his way toward the river crossing, his heart heavy with a tangled mixture of fear, anger, and a growing suspicion that the answers waiting for him on the other side of that border would change everything he thought he understood about his own past, his own pack, and the people he had trusted most throughout his life. The river crossing looked different in the fading light than it had during his frantic search the night before, the water catching gold and copper tones from the setting sun, the old mill on the far bank standing silent as a silhouette against the darkening sky. Damien arrived with a small contingent of his most trusted fighters, positioned discreetly among the trees while he stepped forward alone to the water's edge, honoring the terms of the meeting as agreed. Kale appeared on the opposite bank moments later, flanked by two of his own wolves who kept respectful distance, allowing their leader to approach the crossing point alone as well. The two men studied each other across the narrow stretch of water, years of inherited hostility hanging thick in the air between them, neither willing to be the first to speak. "You have something that belongs to me," Damien finally said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, carefully controlled, despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "She belongs to no one but herself," Kale replied evenly. "Though I understand your concern. Elena is safe, Damien. She came to my territory by choice, seeking answers to questions that seemed to have troubled her deeply enough to interrupt her own wedding." "What questions?" Damien demanded. "What could possibly be important enough to make her run from me, from our future together, into the hands of my enemies?" Kale studied him for a long moment before responding, as though weighing how much truth the moment could bear, without triggering an explosion of violence that neither of them wanted. "Questions about your mother's death," he said finally, "and about who might have benefited from ensuring that death was never properly investigated." The words hit Damien like a physical blow, and for a moment, he simply stood frozen at the water's edge, unable to process the implication buried within Kale's careful statement. "My mother died of illness," he said slowly. "During a harsh winter. Everyone knows this." "Everyone was told this," Kale corrected gently. "Whether it represents the full truth is a separate matter entirely, one that Elena has been investigating, and one that has led her to some troubling conclusions about someone close to you." Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides, torn between the instinct to dismiss Kale's words as manipulation designed to sow distrust within Blackthorn's ranks, and a deeper, more unsettling recognition that certain details about his mother's death had never quite made sense to him either. Questions he had buried long ago, rather than confront the grief and uncertainty they stirred. "Bring her here," Damien said, his voice tight. "Let her tell me herself." Cale hesitated. "I would prefer she remain in my territory a while longer, under protection, until we better understand the danger she may be facing. If what she suspects is true, then whoever is responsible for your mother's death may see her as a serious threat, someone capable of exposing a secret that has remained hidden for years. You're suggesting someone within my own pack murdered my mother, and has continued operating within my inner circle ever since," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous. "That is a serious accusation, Cale, and I will not accept it without proof, especially not from someone who has spent years plotting against Blackthorn. I have plotted nothing against your pack, beyond simple survival and the protection of my own people," Cale replied, his tone hardening slightly for the first time. "But I have watched, for years, as tensions between our packs escalated, at moments that seemed suspiciously convenient for certain individuals within Blackthorn, who benefited from continued conflict. Individuals who would lose everything if peace between our territories were ever fully achieved." Damien felt the ground shifting beneath years of assumptions he had never thought to question. Assumptions about the source of hostility between Blackthorn and Ravenswood. Assumptions about loyalty and trust within his own ranks. He thought of Roran's carefully controlled expression earlier that day, the flicker of something unreadable crossing his features, when Damien mentioned Elena's question about his mother. "I want to see her," Damien said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of some of its earlier fury. "Tonight. I need to hear this from her directly, and I need to understand what she believes she has discovered before I can decide how to proceed." Cale studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against the risks of allowing Blackthorn's alpha into his own territory, however briefly. "You may cross," he said finally, "alone, and only to see her. Your fighters remain here, and mine will remain with them, as a measure of trust between our packs during this fragile moment." Damien turned briefly, to signal his fighters to hold their position, ignoring the obvious tension rippling through their ranks at the prospect of their leader crossing alone into enemy territory. He turned back to face Cale and stepped into the shallow water, crossing the boundary that had separated their two peoples for generations, driven not by diplomacy or strategy, but by a desperate need to understand what had truly happened, to drive Elena away from him on the night that was supposed to bind them together forever. As he reached the far bank and fell into step beside Cale, walking deeper into territory he had avoided his entire life, Damien felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him harder than ever before. Uncertain whether he was walking toward the truth that would finally make sense of his mother's death, or toward a betrayal so deep it would shatter every foundation his life had been built upon. Elena had been informed of Damien's approach only minutes before he arrived, and she stood in the small courtyard outside her quarters, her heart pounding with a complicated mixture of relief, guilt, and lingering fear, as she watched him cross through the gates alongside Cale, his expression a storm of emotions he was clearly struggling to contain. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and for a moment neither of them moved, the weight of everything unspoken between them hanging heavy in the evening air. Then Damien closed the distance quickly, his hands finding hers, his eyes searching her face for any sign of injury or distress. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with worry. "Did anyone harm you?" "I'm fine," Elena said quickly. "No one has hurt me, Damien. I promise you that." His shoulders relaxed slightly at her reassurance, though the tension in his jaw remained, the questions clearly still burning behind his eyes. "Then tell me why," he said quietly. "Tell me why you ran from our wedding, why you crossed into Ravenswood territory alone, why you're standing here now, instead of at home where you belong." Elena glanced briefly at Cale, who gave a small nod of encouragement, then met Damien's gaze directly, knowing the moment for honesty had finally arrived, regardless of the pain it might cause. "I found letters," she said, "in the Blackthorn archive, hidden in a locked drawer. Letters written to your mother in the months before she died, warning her that her life might be in danger, warning that whatever happened to the letter writer might happen to her as well." Damien's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something darker, more troubled. "What letters? Written by whom?" "I don't know for certain," Elena admitted. But the final letter suggested that your mother's death was not an accident, not simply illness as everyone has always believed. And when I researched further, cross-referencing names from that period, one name kept appearing in connection with events surrounding her death. A name that still holds significant power within Blackthorn today. Whose name? Damien asked, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer, perhaps had feared it for longer than he consciously realized. Elena hesitated only a moment before speaking the name aloud. Roran. The silence that followed felt endless, Damien standing motionless as the accusation settled over him, his mind clearly racing through years of memories, years of trust, built with the man who had stood beside him since childhood, searching for some detail that might confirm or deny the terrible possibility Elena had just presented. "That's a serious accusation," he finally said, his voice tight. "Roran has served my family faithfully for years. He was devastated when my mother died. I remember his grief clearly. Elena, it was not manufactured." "I'm not saying this to hurt you," Elena said gently, stepping closer, her hand finding his arm. "I'm telling you because someone left a warning under my pillow the night before our wedding, urging me to ask you about your mother before I said my vows. Someone wanted me to know the truth, or at least wanted me to start asking the right questions. And when I went to meet whoever left that warning, Ravenswood wolves found me instead, close enough to the meeting point that I believe they may have been protecting me from something, or someone." Damien turned to Cale, his expression hardening slightly. "Did your pack know about this letter writer? Did you orchestrate this meeting to manipulate Elena into fleeing our wedding?" "No," Cale said firmly. "We had no knowledge of any letter or any planned meeting. My wolves found Elena near the old mill, alone and clearly in distress, and brought her to safety as a precaution, nothing more. What she has told me since arriving here about her research in your archive is news to me as well, though it aligns troublingly well with suspicions my own pack has held for years about the true source of hostility between our territories." Damien ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything crashing down on him at once, the careful order of his understanding about his own life beginning to crumble under the pressure of new information he had never anticipated confronting. "If this is true," he said slowly, "if Roran truly had something to do with my mother's death, then he has been standing beside me for years, offering counsel, shaping decisions that affected the entire pack, all while hiding a secret capable of destroying everything I thought I understood about loyalty and trust." "We don't have proof yet," Elena said carefully. "Only suspicion, built from old letters and patterns in historical records. Before we make any accusation, we need to find whoever wrote those letters, if they're still alive, and we need concrete evidence, connecting Roran directly to your mother's death." Damien nodded slowly, though the storm behind his eyes had not fully calmed, anger and grief and betrayal, all warring for dominance, as he processed the possibility that someone he trusted completely might have been responsible for one of the deepest wounds of his life. "How do we find this letter writer?" he asked. "Where do we even begin?" Cale spoke up then, his expression thoughtful. "There were a handful of individuals close to your mother during that period, who might have had the standing and the access to correspond with her privately, as the letters suggest. Some have since passed, but a few remain alive, scattered across the region. If we can identify the writer and confirm their fears were justified, we may finally have the proof needed to expose whatever truth has been buried for so long." As the three of them stood together in the fading evening light, an unlikely alliance beginning to form between enemies out of necessity, Damien felt the ground shifting beneath everything he had once believed certain, his trust in his oldest friend crumbling with each passing moment, replaced by a growing determination to uncover the truth no matter where that pursuit might lead him, even if it meant working alongside the one pack he had spent his entire life taught to distrust above all others. "There is someone," Cale said after a moment of careful thought, "an elderly healer named Margaret, who once served Blackthorn before retiring, many years ago, to a small village near the southern border. She was close to your mother during her final years, Damien, close enough that I recall my own father mentioning suspicions about her sudden departure from Blackthorn shortly after the Queen's death, a departure that always seemed hurried, almost as though she were fleeing, rather than simply retiring." Damien's brow furrowed as he searched his memory for any recollection of the healer Cale described. "I remember a woman by that description, vaguely, from when I was young. She left Blackthorn not long after my mother's funeral. I never questioned it at the time. I was too young to understand the significance of such details. If she is still alive, Elena said, hope creeping into her voice for the first time since arriving in Ravenswood territory. She might be able to confirm whether she wrote those letters, and she might know more about what truly happened to your mother than anyone else remaining today. The village Cale mentioned is a full day's journey from here, Damien said, calculating the distance in his mind. If we're going to pursue this lead, we'll need to move quickly and quietly, without drawing attention from anyone at Blackthorn, who might report our movements back to Roran before we have the chance to gather proof. Agreed, Cale said. I can provide an escort to ensure your safety along the journey, given the sensitivity of what we're pursuing. It would also serve as a demonstration of good faith between our packs, cooperation rather than continued hostility, at least for the duration of this investigation. Damien hesitated only briefly before nodding, recognizing the practical wisdom in Cale's offer despite years of ingrained distrust urging him to refuse any assistance from Ravenswood. Very well, he said, but I want it understood that this arrangement extends only to this specific matter. It does not resolve the broader tensions between our packs, and it certainly does not erase years of hostility built on genuine grievances that predate whatever Roran may have manipulated for his own benefit. Understood, Cale replied evenly. I have no illusions about erasing generations of conflict through a single cooperative effort. But if we can expose the truth about your mother's death and confirm that Roran has been manipulating tensions between our packs for his own gain, it may at least open the door to genuine peace negotiations in the future, negotiations built on truth, rather than inherited grudges neither of us fully understands. Elena watched the exchange between the two alphas with cautious optimism, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding before her, an alliance born not from friendship or trust, but from a shared pursuit of justice that transcended the old rivalries neither man had chosen, but both had inherited. She thought of Roran, of his careful expressions and calculated silences, and wondered how deep his deception truly ran, wondered how many years of manipulation had shaped the conflict between these two packs, conflict that had cost lives and resources on both sides, for reasons that may have had nothing to do with genuine territorial disputes at all. As night fully descended over the valley, plans began to take shape for the journey ahead, a small group preparing to travel south at first light, in search of a healer who might hold the final piece of evidence needed to expose a truth buried for years beneath layers of grief, assumption, and careful manipulation. Damien remained close to Elena throughout the planning, his hand rarely leaving hers, as though physical contact alone could reassure him that she was truly safe, truly present, after the terrifying uncertainty of the previous night. I'm sorry, Elena said quietly at one point, when they found a brief moment alone near the edge of the courtyard. I should have told you about the letters before running. I was afraid, and I didn't want to hurt you with suspicions I couldn't yet prove. I understand why you were afraid, Damien said gently, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her hand. But please, whatever happens next, don't run from me again. Whatever truth we uncover about Roran, about my mother, we face it together, not separately. Elena nodded, leaning into him, grateful for the warmth of his presence after the isolation and fear of the previous night. Together, she agreed softly, and as the first stars began to emerge overhead, she allowed herself a small measure of hope that whatever darkness awaited them on the road ahead, they would face it as partners, united, rather than divided, by secrets that had remained hidden for far too long. They departed at first light, a small group consisting of Damien, Elena, Cale, and 2 trusted Ravenswood scouts, who knew the southern routes well enough to navigate quickly and quietly, avoiding the main roads where word of Blackthorn's alpha, traveling alongside his sworn rival, might spread too easily. Elena rode close beside Damien, the borrowed clothes Fiona had given her the previous day, replaced now with sturdier traveling gear, suited for the journey ahead, though her wedding gown remained folded carefully in a small bag, a strange keepsake from a ceremony that had never reached its conclusion. The journey took them through unfamiliar terrain, forests giving way to rolling hills, and eventually, to a patchwork of small farming villages scattered across the southern reaches of the region, communities that existed largely independent of the political tensions dominating the territories to the north. Kale's scouts led with quiet confidence, occasionally exchanging brief words in low voices to confirm their route, while Damien remained largely silent throughout the ride, his thoughts clearly consumed by the weight of what they were pursuing. "You've grown quiet," Elena observed, during a brief pause to rest the horses near midday. "I keep thinking about all the moments Roran comforted me after my mother's death," Damien admitted, his voice heavy with a grief that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. "If he was responsible, if he sat beside me at her funeral, offering words of comfort, while knowing exactly what he had done, I don't know how I reconcile that with the man I've called my closest advisor for years." "We don't know for certain yet," Elena reminded him gently. "That's exactly why we're making this journey, to find proof one way or another, before either of us allows suspicion to harden into certainty, without evidence to support it." Damien nodded, though the tension in his shoulders suggested her words offered only partial comfort against the storm of doubt swirling through his mind. Kale, riding a short distance ahead, glanced back occasionally, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena noticed him watching Damien with something that might have been sympathy, an unexpected softening, in a man she had initially assumed capable only of calculated strategy where Blackthorn was concerned. By late afternoon, they reached the small village Kale's scouts had identified, a cluster of modest homes nestled against a hillside, smoke rising lazily from chimneys as villagers went about their daily routines with no awareness of the tension carried by the travelers approaching from the north. Kale's scouts made discreet inquiries among the villagers, eventually directing the group toward a small cottage at the edge of the settlement, its garden well tended, its windows framed with simple curtains that spoke of a quiet, unremarkable life. Damien knocked on the door himself, his heart pounding with anticipation as he waited for a response. After a long moment, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman, her hair silver, and her posture slightly stooped with age, though her eyes remained sharp and alert as she studied the group standing before her cottage. Recognition flickered across her features almost immediately as her gaze settled on Damien. "You have your mother's eyes," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I wondered if this day would ever come." "Margaret?" Damien asked, though the answer was already clear from her reaction. "Yes," she said. "Please, come inside, quickly. It isn't safe to discuss this where others might overhear." The cottage interior was modest but warm, filled with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, evidence of the healing craft Margaret had practiced throughout her long life. She gestured for them to sit around a small wooden table, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea for her unexpected guests, the simple domestic ritual seeming to steady her nerves somewhat before she finally spoke. "I wrote those letters," she said, addressing Elena directly, her eyes carrying a weight of guilt that had clearly followed her for years. "I assume that is why you've come. I recognized the description when word reached me, quietly, through channels I still maintain, that someone had discovered them in the Blackthorn archive." "You knew someone found them?" Elena asked, surprised. "I have old friends still within Blackthorn," Margaret said. "Word travels, even to someone who left as quietly as I did. When I heard whispers of a locked drawer being opened, of letters being discovered, I feared this moment might arrive, and I have spent every day since deciding whether I would have the courage to tell the truth if it did." "Then tell us," Damien said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, what happened to my mother?" Margaret set down her teacup, her hands folding carefully in her lap as she gathered the courage to speak words she had clearly kept buried for decades. "Your mother discovered that Roran had been secretly negotiating with parties outside Blackthorn, arrangements that would have benefited him personally, at the expense of the Pack's broader interests. Arrangements involving resources and territory that should have belonged to the collective good, rather than lining one man's pockets. She confronted him privately, giving him the chance to end these arrangements quietly, before she brought the matter before the Pack Council. And he refused," Damien said, dread settling heavy in his chest. "He agreed, outwardly," Margaret said. "But I believe now, looking back with the clarity that only years of hindsight can provide, that he never intended to truly end those arrangements. Your mother grew increasingly ill not long after that confrontation, a sudden decline that the healers at the time attributed to a particularly harsh strain of winter fever. I was young then, still learning my craft, but something about her symptoms never sat right with me. They progressed too quickly, responded to nothing we tried, and left her weakened in ways that illness alone rarely explained. "You believe she was poisoned," Elena said quietly. "I believe it strongly, though I could never prove it," Margaret said, her voice trembling with old grief. "I raised my concerns quietly to a few trusted colleagues, and shortly afterward, I began receiving warnings, subtle at first, then increasingly direct, suggesting that my continued presence at Blackthorn carried risks I would be wise to avoid. I fled south within weeks of the Queen's death, terrified for my own safety, carrying guilt ever since for abandoning the pursuit of truth in favor of my own survival." Damien sat in stunned silence, the confirmation of suspicions he had never fully allowed himself to voice, settling over him like a physical weight, crushing the last remnants of trust he had maintained for a man who had stood beside him for years while hiding the truth of his mother's murder. "Will you testify to this before the Blackthorn Council?" Damien asked finally, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. Margaret hesitated, fear flickering across her weathered features. "If Roran learns I have spoken, my life will be in danger, just as it was decades ago." "You will have protection," Cale said, speaking for the first time since entering the cottage. "From both Blackthorn and Ravenswood, should you agree to help expose the truth. This is no longer simply a matter affecting one pack. Roran's manipulations have shaped tensions between our territories for years, costing lives and resources that could have been better spent building genuine peace, rather than fueling a conflict engineered for one man's personal gain." Margaret looked between the faces gathered around her table, weighing decades of fear against the possibility of finally speaking the truth she had carried silently for so long. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I will testify," she said. "The Queen deserved justice long ago. I should have found the courage to demand it myself, rather than fleeing into hiding. Perhaps this is my chance to finally make amends for that failure." As evening settled over the small village, the group began preparations for the journey back north, now carrying not only suspicion, but genuine testimony, capable of exposing Roran's crimes before the entire Blackthorn pack. Damien remained largely silent throughout the preparations, his mind clearly consumed by the enormity of what awaited him upon their return, the confrontation with a man he had trusted as family, a confrontation that would demand justice for a mother he had mourned for years without ever understanding the true circumstances of her death. Elena stayed close beside him, offering quiet comfort without pressing him to speak before he was ready, understanding that the path ahead would require every ounce of strength he could gather, not only to confront Roran, but to hold his pack together through the devastating revelation that someone within their own ranks had orchestrated such profound betrayal for years without detection. Back at Blackthorn, Roran had grown increasingly uneasy as the day wore on without any word from Damien regarding the meeting at the river crossing. He had expected a swift resolution, either Elena's return under guard or news of conflict erupting at the border, but instead, silence stretched through the afternoon and into evening, an absence of information that gnawed at his carefully maintained composure. He questioned Ivy directly, probing for any details she might have received about the Alpha's whereabouts, but she offered only vague reassurances that Damien had crossed briefly into Ravenswood territory to negotiate Elena's return and had not yet reported back with further instructions. Roran forced himself to accept this explanation outwardly, though inwardly his unease deepened with each passing hour. Old instincts honed over years of careful manipulation, warning him that something had shifted beyond his control. He retreated to his private quarters that evening, pacing restlessly as he considered the possibilities. If Elena had genuinely discovered something incriminating during her research in the archive, and if she had somehow connected that discovery to Cale and the wolves of Ravenswood, then the careful balance he had maintained for years, a balance built on controlled hostility between the two packs that conveniently obscured his own ongoing arrangements benefiting from that conflict, might finally be unraveling. He thought back to the locked drawer in the archive, the one containing letters he had assumed destroyed decades ago, disposed of quietly after Margaret's hasty departure had eliminated the immediate threat of exposure. He had believed the matter settled permanently, a dangerous chapter closed and buried beneath years of careful reputation building as Damien's most trusted advisor. If those letters had somehow survived, hidden away and forgotten rather than destroyed as he had assumed, then Elena's research in the archive represented a threat he had never anticipated needing to address. Roran moved to his desk and began drafting a message, his hands steady despite the anxiety churning beneath his composed exterior. A message intended for contacts he had cultivated over the years, individuals positioned to help him manage threats that traditional pack authority could not easily address. If Elena and Damien returned with evidence capable of exposing his role in the Queen's death, he would need contingencies in place, ways to discredit whatever testimony they gathered, or failing that, ways to ensure such testimony never reached the Pack Council at all. He paused before sealing the message, considering the gravity of what he was preparing to set in motion. Years of careful patience had built his position within Blackthorn, patience that had allowed him to profit quietly from arrangements the wider pack never fully understood, patience that had maintained just enough hostility with Ravenswood to justify continued military spending that conveniently flowed through channels he controlled. If that patience was about to be tested by exposure, he would need to act decisively, ruthlessly if necessary, to protect everything he had built. He thought of Elena, of her quiet intelligence, and her habit of asking questions others had long since stopped considering. Questions that had apparently led her directly toward the truth he had spent decades concealing. She had become far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated when Damien first brought her into the pack as an outsider seeking refuge, and now that danger threatened to collapse everything around him unless he found a way to neutralize it before she and Damien returned with proof capable of destroying him entirely. He sealed the message and called for a runner, dispatching it quietly under cover of darkness, setting into motion contingencies he had hoped never to need, contingencies that would ensure his survival regardless of what truth Damien and Elena might be uncovering somewhere beyond Blackthorn's borders, even if that survival required measures far more drastic than anything he had resorted to in the many years since he first silenced a queen who had threatened to expose his ambitions. The journey back toward Blackthorn began at dawn, Margaret traveling with them now under the protection of both packs, her testimony carefully documented in writing by Cale as an additional safeguard should anything happen to prevent her from speaking directly before the council. The mood among the travelers had shifted noticeably from the tension of the journey south, replaced now by a grim determination, as they carried proof capable of exposing years of betrayal. Damien rode mostly in silence, his mind clearly working through the practical challenges of confronting Roran before the full pack council, weighing how to present such devastating evidence without triggering panic or division among wolves who had trusted Roran's counsel for years. Elena rode close beside him, occasionally offering quiet words of support, though she recognized that some of what he needed to process could only be worked through in his own time, at his own pace. "When we arrive," Damien said during a brief pause to rest the horses, "I need to gather the council quickly, before Roran has any chance to prepare a defense, or worse, before he has a chance to silence Margaret, the way he apparently silenced anyone else who threatened to expose him years ago." "He may already suspect something is wrong," Cale pointed out. "Your extended absence, combined with Elena's continued presence in Ravenswood territory, would be difficult to explain away indefinitely. If he's as calculating as the evidence suggests, he's likely already considering how to protect himself." "Which means we need to move faster than he expects," Elena said. "Arrive quietly. Gather the council before he has time to react. Present Margaret's testimony alongside the letters I found, and let the pack decide his fate, based on clear evidence, rather than rumor or suspicion." Damien nodded, though the tension in his shoulders suggested the plan offered only limited comfort against the emotional weight of what confronting Roran would truly require. "I keep thinking about all the years he stood beside me," he admitted quietly. "Advising me on pack matters, comforting me through grief, helping me navigate conflicts with Ravenswood that I now understand he may have deliberately provoked. How do I face him, knowing all of that was built on such profound deception?" "You face him the same way you've faced every other challenge as Alpha," Cale said, an unexpected note of respect coloring his voice. "With clarity, with fairness, and with the strength to hold your pack together, even when the truth threatens to shatter everything you thought you understood about the people closest to you. I've watched enough of my own pack's history to know that leadership sometimes demands confronting betrayal from those we trusted most, and the packs that survive such moments are the ones led by alphas willing to prioritize truth over comfortable illusions." Elena watched the exchange with quiet appreciation, recognizing how far the relationship between these two alphas had shifted since their tense confrontation at the river crossing just 2 days earlier. What had begun as hostile negotiation between enemies had evolved, through shared purpose and mutual respect, into something approaching genuine partnership, an alliance neither man could have anticipated when this journey began. As they approached the outskirts of Blackthorn territory late that afternoon, a scout intercepted them with urgent news that immediately shattered the fragile calm they had maintained throughout the return journey. A group of unidentified wolves had launched an attack along the eastern border just hours earlier, striking swiftly before retreating into the forest, leaving behind several injured Blackthorn fighters and unmistakable evidence pointing toward Ravenswood involvement. Cale's expression hardened immediately. "That's impossible. I ordered no such attack, and none of my wolves would act without direct authorization from me." "The evidence at the scene suggests otherwise," the scout said carefully, clearly uncomfortable delivering such contradictory information given Cale's presence alongside their own alpha. "Tracks, markings on weapons left behind, all pointing toward Ravenswood origin." Damien's expression darkened with suspicion, though this time his instincts pointed in a different direction than the obvious accusation the evidence seemed to support. "Roran," he said quietly. "This has his signature written all over it. An attack staged to look like Ravenswood aggression, timed perfectly to reignite hostility between our packs, just as we return with evidence capable of exposing him. He's trying to make it impossible for us to present a unified case against him," Elena realized, the pieces falling into place with unsettling clarity. "If Blackthorn believes Ravenswood just attacked, no one will listen to testimony that implicates Roran while appearing to align you with pack enemies. He's turning the pack against any cooperation with Cale before we even have the chance to expose him." "Then we need to move even faster," Damien said, urgency sharpening his voice. "Before this manufactured attack has time to solidify anger against Ravenswood, before Roran can use this chaos to further consolidate control or eliminate evidence against himself entirely." They pushed their pace toward Blackthorn's main estate, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, greeted immediately by a pack already simmering with anger and fear over the reported attack. Ivy met them at the gates, her expression tight with barely controlled alarm, as she absorbed the sight of Cale accompanying Damien's return, an image that would only fuel suspicion given the timing of the border incident. "We need the council gathered immediately," Damien said firmly, cutting off Ivy's questions before she could voice them. "This attack was not conducted by Ravenswood forces. I have reason to believe it was staged deliberately to prevent evidence I've gathered from being heard fairly." "Evidence of what?" Ivy asked, her confusion evident despite her attempt to maintain composure befitting her position. "Of who truly killed my mother," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, drawing attention from nearby wolves who paused their activities to listen. "And of who has spent years manipulating tensions between Blackthorn and Ravenswood to protect that terrible secret." Word spread quickly through the estate as Damien made his way toward the council chamber, Elena, Cale, and Margaret following close behind, the weight of impending confrontation settling over the entire pack as whispers rippled through gathered wolves trying to understand the sudden, dramatic shift in circumstances. Somewhere within the estate, Roran would already be aware of their arrival, already calculating how to respond to a threat he had likely believed neutralized through his manufactured attack, unaware that Damien had already seen through the manipulation and was moving swiftly to expose the truth before any further damage could be done. As they reached the council chamber, its heavy doors standing closed against the mounting tension outside, Damien paused for a moment, drawing a steadying breath before pushing forward into a confrontation that would determine not only Roran's fate, but the future stability of Blackthorn itself, and perhaps, if truth prevailed, the foundation for a genuine and lasting peace between two packs that had suffered under manufactured hostility for far longer than anyone had ever realized. The council chamber filled quickly as word spread through the estate, elders and senior pack members taking their seats around the ancient stone table that had witnessed countless decisions shaping Blackthorn's history over generations. Roran arrived last, his expression carefully composed despite the obvious tension rippling through the room, his eyes flicking briefly toward Cale's presence, with a flash of something Elena recognized immediately, as calculated alarm quickly suppressed beneath practiced control. "Alpha," Roran said, addressing Damien with measured respect that failed to fully mask the wariness beneath his tone. "I'm relieved to see you've returned safely. though I confess confusion at finding Ravenswood's leader among your company, particularly given this afternoon's troubling events along our border." "That attack is precisely what we need to discuss," Damien said, his voice carrying steady authority, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath his composed exterior. "Because I have strong reason to believe it was not conducted by Ravenswood forces at all, but staged deliberately, to prevent testimony I've gathered from receiving fair hearing before this council." Murmurs rippled through the assembled elders, confusion and concern evident on weathered faces unaccustomed to such dramatic proceedings, disrupting their usual measured deliberations. Roran's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena noted the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his posture that suggested growing unease beneath his controlled exterior. "Testimony regarding what matter?" one of the elder council members asked, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent observing pack politics with sharp, discerning attention. Damien's gaze settled on Roran directly as he spoke, his voice steady despite the personal devastation clearly still fresh beneath his composed delivery. "Regarding my mother's death," he said, "new evidence has come to light, suggesting she did not die of natural illness, as we have all believed for years, but was instead deliberately poisoned by someone within our own ranks, someone who has continued serving this pack in a position of significant trust ever since." The chamber fell into stunned silence, elders exchanging shocked glances as the implications of Damien's words settled over the gathered assembly. Roran's composure finally cracked slightly, a flash of something raw and calculating crossing his features before he forced his expression back toward careful neutrality. "That is a serious accusation," Roran said, his voice measured despite the tension now clearly visible in his rigid posture. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim, or are we simply meant to accept speculation, born from grief and the stress of recent events?" "We have evidence," Elena said, stepping forward to address the council directly, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Letters written to the Queen, in the months before her death, warning her that her life was in danger. And we have testimony from someone who knew the truth firsthand, someone who fled Blackthorn decades ago out of fear for her own safety, after raising concerns about the Queen's sudden decline." She gestured toward Margaret, who stepped forward hesitantly, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she faced the assembled council, decades of buried fear evident in her cautious posture, despite the courage it had taken to return to this place after so many years of self-imposed exile. "I served as a healer to the Queen during her final years," Margaret said, her voice quavering slightly, before steadying with determined resolve. "I witnessed her confront a member of this council about arrangements he had made that betrayed the pack's interests for his own personal gain. Shortly afterward, her health declined rapidly, in ways that never matched the symptoms of any illness I had encountered in my years of practice. When I raised my concerns, I began receiving warnings that convinced me my own life would be forfeit if I continued pursuing the matter. I fled that same season, and I have carried the guilt of my silence for every year since." All eyes in the chamber turned slowly toward Roran, whose careful composure had finally begun to crumble under the weight of testimony that aligned too precisely with circumstances only someone genuinely guilty would recognize. He rose from his seat, his expression hardening into something colder, more desperate than Elena had ever witnessed from him before. "This is absurd," he said, though the conviction in his voice had noticeably weakened. An old woman's fading memories, combined with letters that could have been written by anyone, seeking to manipulate this council through false accusation. "I have served this pack faithfully for decades, and I refuse to stand here while baseless claims threaten to destroy everything I've built in service to Blackthorn." "Then explain the attack this afternoon," Damien said, his voice cutting through Roran's protests with cold precision. "Explain how an assault staged to look exactly like Ravenswood aggression occurred at precisely the moment we returned carrying evidence against you, timed perfectly to inflame hostility against the very pack whose alpha stood beside me, gathering proof of your crimes." Roran's eyes flicked briefly toward the chamber's exit, a calculating glint flashing across his features that confirmed everything Elena and Damien had suspected long before this confrontation began. The elders watched the exchange with growing alarm, the weight of realization settling over the chamber, as Roran's carefully maintained facade continued crumbling under the mounting evidence arrayed against him. "You have no proof connecting me to any attack," Roran said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. replaced now by something closer to desperate calculation, as he searched for an escape from the trap, closing steadily around him. "We have enough," Damien said quietly, "to demand a full investigation, one that will examine every arrangement you've made, every decision you've influenced over the years, and every convenient escalation of hostility with Ravenswood that happened to align perfectly with your own personal benefit. If you are innocent, as you claim, such an investigation will clear your name entirely. If you are guilty, as I now believe with absolute certainty, then justice for my mother, delayed far too long, will finally be served." The chamber remained tense and silent as the full council absorbed the gravity of what had just unfolded, Roran standing rigid before them, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling in real time, as decades of hidden manipulation edged closer to devastating exposure, before the very pack he had spent years secretly betraying. The silence in the chamber shattered abruptly as Roran moved with sudden, desperate speed, shoving past the nearest council members and bolting toward the chamber's side exit before anyone could react to stop him. Chaos erupted immediately, elders scrambling from their seats, guards stationed near the entrance rushing forward in response to the Alpha's sharp command to prevent his escape. Damien moved fastest, his years of training as pack leader propelling him after Roran with a speed that closed the distance quickly despite Roran's desperate head start. Cale followed close behind, his own instincts honed through years of leading Ravenswood's forces, while Elena remained near Margaret, ensuring the elderly healer's safety amid the sudden pandemonium filling the chamber. Roran burst through the side exit into a narrow corridor leading toward the estate's private quarters, his mind clearly racing through whatever contingencies he had prepared for exactly this scenario. Contingencies built from years of careful planning, against the possibility that his carefully maintained deception might one day face exposure. Damien caught up to him near a junction where the corridor split toward the outer grounds, tackling him with enough force to send them both crashing against the stone wall. "It's over, Roran," Damien said, pinning him firmly despite Roran's continued struggle against his grip. "Running only confirms everything we already know to be true." Roran's eyes blazed with desperate fury, all pretense of calm composure abandoned entirely, now that his careful facade had collapsed beyond any hope of recovery. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for this pack," he spat, still struggling against Damien's hold. "The arrangements I made protected Blackthorn's resources far more effectively than your mother's naive idealism ever could have managed. She would have exposed those arrangements to the entire council, destroying advantages that took years to carefully build, and I refused to let her foolishness undo everything I had accomplished." "So you murdered her," Damien said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury and grief intertwined. "You poisoned the woman who trusted you, who considered you family, simply to protect arrangements that benefited only yourself." "I protected this pack," Roran insisted, though the words rang hollow, even to his own ears, given the raw desperation now driving his voice. "Everything I've done since then, every decision, every carefully managed conflict with Ravenswood, has served Blackthorn's greater interests." "You served your own interests," Cale said, arriving alongside Damien, his expression carrying the weight of years spent watching his own pack suffer under manufactured hostility that Roran had orchestrated for personal gain. "Every conflict between our territories, every life lost on both sides throughout years of unnecessary tension, all of it serving your ambition rather than any genuine benefit to either pack." Roran's struggle finally weakened, exhaustion and the crushing weight of exposure settling over him as guards arrived to properly restrain him under Damien's firm command. As they led him away toward secure confinement, his expression shifted one final time, from desperate defiance to something closer to hollow resignation, decades of carefully maintained deception finally crumbling entirely under the weight of undeniable truth. Damien remained standing in the corridor for a long moment after Roran's removal, his chest heaving with the aftermath of physical exertion and emotional devastation combined, the reality of everything he had just confronted settling over him with crushing finality. Elena arrived moments later, having ensured Margaret's safety amid the chaos, her expression softening with concern as she took in Damien's obvious distress. "It's over," she said gently, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "You did it, Damien. You found justice for your mother, after all these years." "It doesn't feel like victory," Damien admitted quietly. his voice rough with unshed grief. "It feels like losing someone I trusted for years, discovering that the comfort he offered after her death was nothing but calculated performance, meant to maintain his own position." "Grief and justice can exist together," Elena said softly, drawing him into a gentle embrace that he accepted gratefully, his arms wrapping around her as the adrenaline of the confrontation finally began to fade, replaced by exhaustion, and the complicated weight of truths finally brought into the light after years buried beneath careful lies. Cale watched the exchange with quiet respect, recognizing the personal cost of justice achieved through such painful revelation, understanding intimately the complicated grief that came with confronting betrayal from someone trusted deeply for years. "The council will need to determine appropriate consequences," he said quietly, "but the truth is finally exposed, Damien, and that alone represents a victory worth acknowledging, regardless of how painful the path toward it has been." Damien nodded slowly, drawing strength from Elena's steady presence beside him, and from the unexpected solidarity offered by a man he had spent his entire life viewing as an enemy, now standing beside him as an ally in pursuit of justice long overdue. As the chaos in the estate gradually settled into the quieter work of processing everything that had just unfolded, Damien felt the first tentative stirrings of relief beginning to replace the grief and anger that had consumed him throughout this devastating day. Relief born from the knowledge that his mother's memory could finally rest with the truth acknowledged, and that the manufactured hostility, poisoning relations between Blackthorn and Ravenswood, might finally begin healing after years of unnecessary conflict. The following morning, the full Blackthorn Council convened again, this time to determine Roran's fate through proper proceedings, rather than the chaotic confrontation that had exposed his crimes the previous evening. Word of the revelation had spread quickly throughout the pack, and the atmosphere within the estate carried a complicated mixture of shock, grief, and cautious relief, as wolves who had long respected Roran's counsel grappled with the devastating truth of his betrayal. Damien presided over the proceedings with careful composure, though Elena could see the toll the previous day had taken on him, exhaustion evident beneath his controlled exterior, as he guided the council through examining evidence methodically, ensuring every wolf present understood the full scope of Roran's deception before any judgment was rendered. Margaret provided additional testimony, her voice growing steadier with each retelling, as the weight of decades of silence finally lifted from her shoulders. Other evidence emerged, as the investigation deepened throughout the morning, records uncovered within Roran's private quarters, revealing the true extent of his manipulations, arrangements with outside parties that had funneled pack resources toward his personal benefit for years, carefully falsified reports that had exaggerated Ravenswood aggression to justify continued military spending under his direct oversight. The picture that emerged painted a portrait of calculated betrayal spanning far longer than anyone had previously suspected, a web of deception that had shaped Blackthorn's policies and its hostile relationship with Ravenswood for the better part of 2 decades. By midday, the council reached its verdict, stripping Roran of all rank and position within Blackthorn, sentencing him to permanent exile from pack territory, a consequence that carried its own weight of finality for a wolf who had spent his entire adult life building status and influence within the only home he had ever known. Damien delivered the sentence personally, his voice steady despite the personal grief still evident beneath his measured words, watching as guards led Roran from the estate grounds for the final time, his expression hollow with the recognition that decades of careful ambition had ultimately cost him everything he had sought to protect. As the proceedings concluded and the council chamber began to empty, Damien remained seated for a long moment, processing the finality of everything that had unfolded across these past few devastating days. Elena approached quietly, settling into the seat beside him, offering her presence without demanding conversation he wasn't yet ready to provide. "How are you feeling?" she finally asked, when the silence had stretched long enough that she sensed he needed the gentle prompt to voice whatever emotions still churned beneath his composed exterior. "Relieved," Damien admitted slowly, "and exhausted. And grieving all over again, though this time for a different reason than I've grieved my mother's death for years. I think part of me is mourning the version of my past I believed in, the friendship I thought I shared with Roran, the comfort I believed was genuine during my darkest moments after her death." "That grief is valid," Elena said gently. "You're allowed to mourn the illusion, even while finding relief in the truth. Both things can exist together. Damien turned to look at her fully, his expression softening with gratitude, and something deeper, that had only grown stronger through the trials of the past few days. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on finding the truth, even when it meant running into enemy territory alone, even when it meant risking everything we had built together." "I couldn't marry you with that letter's warning hanging over us unanswered," Elena said honestly. "I needed to know the truth, for both our sakes, even though I never anticipated it would lead us through everything we've faced these past days." Cale entered the chamber quietly, as their conversation reached its natural pause, his expression carrying the weight of his own reflections on everything that had transpired. "The council has also asked me to remain through the afternoon," he said, "to begin preliminary discussions about what genuine peace between our territories might look like, now that the true source of our manufactured hostility has finally been exposed and removed." Damien rose to face him fully, extending a hand that Cale accepted without hesitation, a gesture that would have seemed impossible between these two alphas just days earlier, before circumstances had forced them into unlikely alliance against a common threat neither had fully understood, until Elena's courage set these events into motion. "I believe," Damien said, "that we owe both our packs a genuine attempt at lasting peace, built on truth, rather than the false grievances Roran manufactured to serve his own ambitions. Years of unnecessary conflict have cost both our territories far more than either of us fully realized, until these past few days revealed the truth behind so much of that hostility." "I agree completely," Cale replied, "though rebuilding trust between our peoples will require patience and consistent effort beyond just this moment of shared purpose. Old wounds don't heal overnight, regardless of how clearly we now understand their manufactured origins." "Then we begin today," Damien said, "with honest conversation and a genuine commitment to building something better than the hostility we both inherited. Hostility that served only one man's ambition, at the cost of both our people's well-being, for far too many years." As the afternoon stretched forward into detailed discussions about border arrangements, resource sharing, and the practical steps needed to begin genuine reconciliation between two packs that had suffered under artificial conflict for decades, Elena watched with quiet pride as Damien navigated these unprecedented negotiations with the same steady leadership that had guided Blackthorn through the devastating revelations of recent days, grateful that her courage in pursuing the truth had led not only to justice for his mother, but potentially to a lasting peace that could benefit generations of wolves on both sides of a border that had divided their peoples for far too long. The weeks that followed brought a steady transformation to Blackthorn, the pack slowly adjusting to life without Roran's long-standing presence in matters of governance, while simultaneously navigating the unprecedented process of building genuine cooperation with Ravenswood after generations of inherited hostility. Damien found himself working closely with Ivy to fill the gaps left by Roran's absence, elevating trusted wolves into positions of greater responsibility, carefully rebuilding the structures of trust that had been quietly corrupted for years, without anyone recognizing the extent of the manipulation at play. Elena remained active throughout this period, continuing her work in the archive with renewed purpose, cataloging records more thoroughly than before, ensuring that no other hidden truths remained buried beneath careless organization or deliberate concealment. She found unexpected satisfaction in the work, a sense of contributing meaningfully to Blackthorn's future even as she processed her own complicated feelings about the events that had unfolded since that fateful night she fled her own wedding. Margaret chose to remain at Blackthorn rather than returning to her quiet life in the southern village, finding purpose in resuming her healing practice after decades away, mentoring younger healers within the pack while slowly reconciling with the community she had fled so many years earlier out of justified fear. Her presence served as a living reminder of both the cost of Roran's deception and the resilience possible even after such prolonged periods of silence and fear. Cale visited Blackthorn regularly during this period, the negotiations between the two packs progressing steadily as both alphas worked through decades of accumulated grievances, separating genuine territorial disputes from the manufactured hostility Roran had deliberately inflamed for his own benefit. Elena watched their relationship evolve from cautious cooperation into something approaching genuine friendship, two leaders finding common ground through shared experience and mutual respect, earned through crisis rather than comfortable circumstance. "I never imagined I would call an alpha from Blackthorn a friend," Cale admitted during one visit, sharing a quiet moment with Elena while Damien attended to other pack matters nearby. Growing up, the stories I heard about your territory painted such a different picture than what I've come to understand through these recent weeks. I imagine the stories told about Ravenswood at Blackthorn were similarly distorted, Elena replied with a small smile. Funny how manufactured conflict shapes perception so thoroughly that we forget to question whether the foundation beneath our assumptions was ever solid to begin with. A lesson I hope both our peoples continue learning long after this immediate crisis has faded from memory, Cale said thoughtfully. Though I confess, some credit belongs to you, Elena. Your courage in pursuing truth, despite the personal cost, set all of this in motion. Without your willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, Roran's deception might have continued indefinitely, and the peace we're now building might never have found its foundation. Elena accepted the compliment with quiet humility, though she recognized the truth in his words, even as she deflected some of the credit toward Damien's own courage in confronting such devastating betrayal from someone he had trusted so completely. Together, their combined determination had exposed a truth that had remained buried for decades, and together, they were now witnessing the beginning of something neither pack had thought possible just weeks earlier. Not everything proceeded smoothly during this period of transition. Investigation into Roran's outside arrangements revealed connections to several parties beyond Blackthorn's borders who had profited from his manipulations over the years. Contacts who grew alarmed as word of his exposure spread through channels beyond the pack's immediate control. One such contact, a merchant who had long supplied resources through arrangements that skimmed unfair profits at Blackthorn's expense, attempted to silence loose ends by sending mercenaries to eliminate anyone who might further expose the network Roran had built. Damien's scouts intercepted the threat before it could materialize into actual danger, apprehending the mercenaries along the southern trade routes before they came anywhere near Blackthorn's borders, their capture yielding additional evidence that helped dismantle the remaining pieces of Roran's carefully constructed criminal network. The merchant responsible faced justice through proper channels, extradited to face consequences for his role in the broader conspiracy that had cost both Blackthorn and Ravenswood so dearly over the years. Through it all, Elena and Damien grew closer than ever, the shared trials of recent weeks forging a bond deeper than what they had carried into their originally planned wedding. A bond built now on complete honesty, rather than the comfortable assumptions that had left room for secrets to fester unnoticed. Damien found himself sharing memories of his mother more openly than he ever had before, memories that Elena listened to with genuine interest and gentle compassion, helping him process grief that had remained complicated and unresolved for years, until the truth finally brought it into proper perspective. "She would have liked you," Damien said one evening, as they sat together in the garden where Elena had first fled that fateful night weeks earlier, the space now feeling entirely different, transformed from a site of fear and uncertainty into a place of quiet reflection and healing. She always believed that courage mattered more than comfortable silence, that truth was worth pursuing, even when it threatened to disrupt the peace we thought we understood. "Then perhaps," Elena said softly, "some part of her courage guided me that night, even though I never had the chance to know her myself." Damien reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the same tender familiarity that had comforted her through countless difficult moments since this journey began. "I believe it did," he said quietly. "I believe her memory has been guiding both of us toward this moment, toward justice finally served, and toward the genuine partnership we're building now, stronger for having weathered such devastating truth together, rather than avoiding it out of fear." As autumn settled over the valley, bringing cooler air and the first golden hints of changing leaves throughout Blackthorn's territory, both packs continued their careful work toward lasting peace, guided by leaders who had learned firsthand the devastating cost of manufactured conflict and the profound value of truth, pursued courageously despite significant personal risk. The formal peace agreement between Blackthorn and Ravenswood took shape gradually over the following month, drafted through careful negotiation sessions that brought together elders and representatives from both packs, working to establish clear boundaries, fair resource sharing arrangements, and mechanisms for resolving future disputes, without resorting to the hostility that had defined relations between their territories for generations. Elena participated actively in these sessions, her thorough documentation of Roran's manipulations providing crucial context that helped both sides understand which grievances reflected genuine historical disputes and which had been artificially inflamed for his personal benefit. Ivy proved instrumental during this period as well, stepping into expanded responsibilities with a steady competence that reassured the pack during a time of significant transition. She and Damien worked closely together, reviewing years of policy decisions that Roran had influenced, identifying which arrangements needed immediate correction and which required more gradual adjustment to avoid destabilizing pack operations that depended on certain established structures, regardless of their questionable origins. One particularly delicate matter involved the wolves who had served under Roran's direct guidance over the years, some of whom had unknowingly participated in operations that served his hidden agenda without understanding the true purpose behind their assigned tasks. Damien insisted on handling these situations with careful fairness, distinguishing between those who had been genuinely deceived and any who might have knowingly participated in Roran's broader conspiracy, ensuring that innocent wolves were not punished for decisions made without full knowledge of the deception underlying them. Fiona, the young woman who had first brought Elena clothing during her stay in Ravenswood territory, became an unexpected bridge between the two packs during this period, volunteering to serve as a liaison who traveled regularly between Blackthorn and Ravenswood, carrying messages and updates as the peace negotiations progressed. Her cheerful determination to see genuine friendship blossom between the two territories provided a welcome contrast to the heavier political discussions dominating formal negotiations, reminding everyone involved of the simpler human connections that manufactured conflict had prevented for far too long. Elena found herself growing close to Fiona during these months, appreciating her genuine warmth and her willingness to see possibility, rather than only obstacles in the delicate work of building peace between historically hostile peoples. Through Fiona, Elena also learned more about daily life within Ravenswood territory, details that helped her understand Cale's leadership style more fully, and appreciate the genuine care he held for his own pack's well-being, care that mirrored Damien's own dedication to Blackthorn, despite the very different circumstances shaping their respective territories. As the peace agreement neared its final form, Damien called for a gathering of both packs along the river that had once marked such a stark boundary between enemy territories, a symbolic ceremony meant to formally recognize the new era of cooperation both leaders hoped to build. Wolves from Blackthorn and Ravenswood stood together along both banks of the water that had separated their peoples for generations, watching as Damien and Cale met at the center of the crossing, the same location where they had once stood as adversaries negotiating Elena's safe return, now transformed into a site of genuine reconciliation. For generations, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowds on both sides of the river, our peoples have viewed each other as enemies, taught to distrust one another, through conflicts we now understand were manufactured and maintained by a single individual, pursuing his own ambitions at tremendous cost to us all. Today, we choose a different path forward, one built on truth rather than inherited grievance, on cooperation rather than manufactured hostility. Cale stepped forward to address the crowd as well, his own words carrying the weight of years spent leading Ravenswood through the shadow of conflict that had cost countless lives on both sides of this very river. This peace we build today, he said, honors not only the truth finally uncovered about the source of our hostility, but also the courage of those who pursued that truth despite significant personal risk. Let this river no longer stand as a boundary between enemies, but as a shared resource, connecting two peoples committed to a better future than the one we inherited. The formal signing of the peace agreement followed, both alphas placing their marks upon the document that would guide relations between their territories moving forward, while wolves from both packs watched with a mixture of cautious hope and genuine relief that the manufactured conflict shaping their entire lives might finally give way to something more sustainable and just. Elena stood beside Damien throughout the ceremony, her heart full with pride at witnessing the culmination of everything they had fought to uncover and rebuild since that terrifying night she had fled her own wedding in search of truth. As the ceremony concluded and both packs began mingling cautiously along the riverbank, sharing food and conversation across boundaries that had felt impossible to cross just months earlier, Damien turned to Elena with an expression she recognized instantly, warmth and determination, combining into something that made her heart skip with anticipation. "There's something I need to ask you," he said quietly, drawing her slightly away from the crowds toward a quieter stretch of riverbank. Something I should have asked properly weeks ago, once we both understood the truth and found our way back to each other, after everything that happened. Elena felt her breath catch, understanding immediately what he intended to ask, even before he reached into his pocket to retrieve the same ring he had once given her weeks earlier, the ring she had left behind on their aborted wedding night, now returned to him for safekeeping during the chaos that followed. "Elena," Damien said, kneeling before her with the same ring, held gently between his fingers, "will you marry me? Not out of assumption or convenience, but with complete honesty between us, with every secret finally brought into the light, with genuine partnership built through everything we've faced together these past months." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she nodded, unable to find words adequate to express the depth of emotion overwhelming her in that moment. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice thick with joy. "Yes, Damien. Completely, and without hesitation this time." He rose to slip the ring back onto her finger, drawing her into an embrace that carried the weight of everything they had endured together, relief and joy and profound love intertwining as the wolves from both packs continued their tentative celebrations along the riverbank behind them, unaware of the quiet, deeply personal moment unfolding just beyond their notice, a moment that promised a wedding this time built entirely on truth rather than unspoken fear. The morning of the second wedding arrived with none of the anxious dread that had haunted Elena during the first attempt months earlier. Sunlight streamed through the windows of her chamber at Blackthorn, warm and golden, casting a gentle glow across the same white gown she had worn once before, carefully cleaned and repaired after the tears and mud it had gathered during that desperate flight through the forest so many weeks ago. Priya helped her prepare once again, though this time her hands moved with steady confidence rather than the nervous uncertainty that had colored her assistance during the first ceremony. "You look happier this time," Priya observed gently, adjusting the delicate veil atop Elena's carefully arranged hair. "Lighter, somehow, like a weight has finally lifted from your shoulders." "It has," Elena admitted with a soft smile. "There's nothing hidden between us anymore. No secrets waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. Just truth, and love, built on that truth." Fiona arrived shortly afterward, having traveled from Ravenswood specifically to assist with the preparations, her cheerful energy filling the room with warmth as she helped arrange the final details of Elena's appearance. "Cale sends his congratulations," she said, along with a promise that Ravenswood's finest will be on their best behavior at today's celebration. "Though I confess, I've heard whispers that several of our younger wolves are quite eager to properly celebrate, now that peace between our packs feels genuinely secure." Elena laughed softly, grateful for the lightness Fiona brought to what could have otherwise felt like an overwhelming morning, given everything that had led to this second attempt at marriage. "I'm glad they're coming," she said. "This wedding should belong to both our packs now, a celebration of everything we've built together since that terrible night in the garden." As the appointed hour approached, Elena made her way toward the great hall once more, her heart steady this time, rather than pounding with the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her during her first walk down this same aisle. The hall had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with flowers and ribbons in colors representing both packs, a visual symbol of the unity that had emerged from months of careful negotiation and genuine reconciliation. Wolves from Blackthorn filled one side of the hall, while Ravenswood's representatives occupied the other, the arrangement itself a quiet testament to how far both peoples had traveled from the hostility that had once seemed so permanent and unchangeable. Margaret sat among the honored guests, her presence a living reminder of the courage required to finally speak truth after decades of fearful silence. Courage that had ultimately made this joyful gathering possible. Damien waited at the altar as Elena began her walk down the aisle, his expression carrying none of the underlying tension that had marked their first attempted ceremony, replaced now by open, unguarded joy that made her heart swell with happiness as she moved steadily toward him. Cale stood nearby as an honored guest, having been invited to stand alongside Damien's closest supporters, a placement that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier, but now felt entirely natural given everything they had endured together. The priestess began the ceremony once more, her voice carrying the same words spoken months earlier, though this time Elena felt no hesitation building in her chest, no unanswered questions clawing at the edges of her resolve. When asked to speak her vows, she did so clearly and without pause, her voice steady and full of genuine conviction as she promised herself to Damien completely, with nothing hidden between them any longer. Damien's own vows carried similar clarity and confidence, his words speaking not only of love, but of gratitude for her courage in pursuing truth, even when it meant risking everything they had built together. Gratitude that had transformed into deeper devotion through the trials they had faced side by side these past months. As he slipped the ring onto her finger for the second time, this time with the ceremony proceeding to its natural conclusion, the hall erupted into celebration, wolves from both packs cheering together, in a moment of shared joy that would have seemed impossible to imagine before the truth about Roran's manipulations had finally come to light. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, tables set throughout the estate grounds laden with food prepared according to traditions from both packs, music filling the air as wolves who had once viewed each other with suspicion and fear now danced and celebrated together, tentative friendships forming that would have been unthinkable just months earlier under the manufactured hostility that had governed relations between their territories for so long. Elena found herself pulled into countless conversations throughout the evening, wolves from both Blackthorn and Ravenswood approaching to offer congratulations and share their own hopes for the continued peace now taking root between their peoples. She listened to stories from elderly wolves who remembered a time before the worst of the hostility, memories of cautious trade, and even occasional friendship between the two territories, before ambition and manipulation had driven them apart. Stories that offered hope that the genuine peace being rebuilt now might eventually restore something even deeper than simple absence of conflict. Cale approached her during a quiet moment in the celebration, his expression warm despite the formal setting. "I want to thank you," he said, "for the courage you showed that night, fleeing into unfamiliar territory in pursuit of truth you couldn't yet fully understand. Without that courage, none of this, the peace, the friendship between our packs, the justice finally served for Damien's mother, none of it would have been possible." "I was terrified that night," Elena admitted honestly. "I didn't feel courageous. I felt desperate and confused, driven by fear more than any clear conviction about what I might find." "Sometimes," Cale said thoughtfully, "courage looks exactly like that. Desperate action, driven by conviction that something important is at stake, even when the path forward remains uncertain. I've come to respect you a great deal, Elena, both for your courage that night and for everything you've contributed toward building genuine understanding between our peoples since." Elena accepted his words with genuine gratitude, reflecting on how much had changed since that terrifying flight through the forest months earlier, how the stranger's mysterious warning had set into motion a chain of events that ultimately led not only to justice for a murdered queen, but to a transformation in relations between two peoples who had suffered under manufactured conflict for far too long. As the evening deepened and stars began to emerge over the celebrating crowds, Damien found Elena near the edge of the festivities, drawing her close for a quiet moment, away from the joyful chaos surrounding them. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, echoing perhaps unconsciously the fears that had haunted them both during the uncertain days following her initial flight from their first wedding attempt. "None," Elena said firmly, leaning into his embrace with complete contentment. Everything that happened, the fear, the uncertainty, even crossing into enemy territory alone that terrifying night, all of it led us here, to this moment, built on truth, rather than the comfortable ignorance we almost settled for instead. Damien pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his heart full with love and gratitude for the woman who had risked everything to uncover truth that ultimately freed him from decades of unknowing betrayal, while simultaneously building a foundation for lasting peace between two peoples who had suffered under needless hostility for far too long. "Then let's welcome whatever comes next together," he said softly, with the same honesty and courage that brought us to this moment. As the celebration continued around them, wolves from Blackthorn and Ravenswood mingling freely, in a scene that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier, Elena allowed herself to fully embrace the joy of the moment. Grateful beyond words for the strange, terrifying, ultimately transformative journey that had led her from fleeing her own wedding in fear to finally marrying the man she loved, with nothing left hidden between them, surrounded by the beginnings of a genuine peace that promised a far brighter future for both their peoples than either could have imagined possible before that fateful night when everything changed. The years that followed brought steady growth to the friendship between Blackthorn and Ravenswood, old wounds gradually healing as new generations grew up without the burden of manufactured hostility shaping their understanding of each other. Damien and Elena remained devoted partners throughout, their marriage strengthened rather than weakened by the trials that had preceded it, their story becoming something of a quiet legend within both packs, a reminder that truth pursued courageously, even at tremendous personal risk, could ultimately transform even the deepest inherited conflicts into genuine and lasting peace. Margaret lived out her remaining years at Blackthorn, finally at peace, after decades of guilt over her silence. Her healing knowledge passed down to a new generation of practitioners, who carried her legacy forward long after she was gone. Cale and Damien remained close allies throughout their respective leaderships, their friendship serving as a model for cooperation that helped guide both packs through whatever future challenges arose, always choosing honest partnership over the manufactured suspicion that had once defined relations between their territories. And on quiet evenings, when Elena found herself reflecting on everything that had led her to this life she now cherished so deeply, she often thought back to that mysterious stranger in the garden, whoever they had been, whatever their true motivations, and felt a quiet gratitude for the warning that had set her on a path toward truth, justice, and a love far stronger than the comfortable ignorance she might have settled for instead, had she simply walked back into that hall and spoken vows without ever asking the questions that changed everything. That question, in fact, found its answer nearly a year after the wedding, on a quiet afternoon when Elena was reviewing recently discovered documents in the archive, alongside a new assistant hired to help manage the growing collection of pack records. Among a bundle of unrelated correspondence, she found a short note tucked between older pages, written in handwriting she recognized instantly from the faded letters she had discovered so long ago in that locked drawer. The note was brief, addressed simply to whoever might find it, dated only weeks before Elena's original wedding attempt. It explained that the writer, a young pack member named Callum, who had worked closely under Roran during those years, had discovered fragments of the truth about the Queen's death through overheard conversations and misplaced documents, fear building steadily as he pieced together the implications of what he had learned. Unable to bring accusations forward directly without risking his own safety, given Roran's position and influence, he had instead left the warning beneath Elena's pillow the night before her wedding, hoping that her natural curiosity and her position as future queen might succeed where his own limited standing within the pack could not. The note explained further that Callum had left Blackthorn shortly after delivering his anonymous warning, fearing that his involvement might eventually be discovered, choosing to relocate somewhere he might live safely, rather than risk retaliation from Roran should his role in exposing the truth ever come to light. He wished, in his final words, for whoever eventually found the note, to know that his intentions had been genuine, driven by a desire to see justice finally served, for a queen who had always treated the pack's younger members with unusual kindness and respect. Elena brought the note to Damien that evening, watching his expression shift through surprise and gratitude as he read the young wolf's explanation for the mysterious warning that had set everything into motion. "Callum," he said softly, recognition flickering across his features. "I remember him vaguely, a quiet young wolf who worked under Roran's direct supervision, handling correspondence and records. I always assumed he simply moved on to different work when he stopped appearing at the estate. He risked everything to leave that warning," Elena said, trusting that I would have the courage to pursue the truth, even without knowing who had sent it, or why. "Then we owe him a debt we may never have the chance to properly repay," Damien said thoughtfully. "Perhaps we should attempt to locate him, to thank him properly for the courage that ultimately led to justice for my mother, and peace between our packs." Their search, conducted quietly over the following months, eventually led them to a small coastal village where Callum had settled after leaving Blackthorn, building a modest life as a fisherman far removed from pack politics and the dangerous secrets he had once uncovered. When Damien and Elena finally found him, his surprise at their arrival gradually gave way to quiet relief upon learning that his anonymous warning had ultimately succeeded in exposing Roran's crimes and restoring genuine peace between Blackthorn and Ravenswood. "I never knew if my note reached you in time," Callum admitted, sitting with them in his simple coastal home, the sound of waves audible through open windows. "I feared for years that I had simply thrown away my safety for nothing, that Roran's power remained too entrenched for any warning to matter. Your courage mattered more than you could have known, Elena told him warmly. Without that warning, I would have married without ever questioning the story I had always accepted about Damien's mother. Roran's deception might have continued indefinitely, and the manufactured hostility between our packs might have persisted for generations more. Damien extended a formal offer for Callum to return to Blackthorn should he wish it, along with recognition for the crucial role he had played in exposing truth that had remained buried for so many years. Callum considered the offer thoughtfully, but ultimately chose to remain in his quiet coastal life, content with the peace he had built for himself, far from the political complexities of pack leadership, though he accepted their gratitude warmly, and promised to maintain contact, now that the danger that had once forced his silence had finally passed. Their journey home from the coastal village gave Elena and Damien time to reflect on the full circle their story had traveled, from a mysterious warning, delivered in desperate secrecy, to a joyful reunion months later, with the very person whose courage had set everything into motion. It's strange, Elena mused during their return journey, how one person's quiet act of courage, taken without any certainty of success, can ultimately reshape the future for so many others who never even knew his name. That's precisely why courage matters, Damien replied, echoing sentiments Cale had once shared with her during those early tense days following her flight into Ravenswood territory. Not because we know the outcome will justify the risk, but because truth and justice deserve pursuit, regardless of the uncertainty involved in seeking them. Back at Blackthorn, life continued its steady rhythm, the pack thriving under Damien's leadership, strengthened rather than weakened by the painful truths that had once threatened to tear apart everything he believed about loyalty and trust. Elena's work in the archive continued as well, though her role gradually expanded beyond simple record-keeping into something closer to advising the council directly on historical matters and precedent. Her thorough understanding of the pack's true history, including its most painful chapters, proving invaluable as Blackthorn navigated its evolving relationship with Ravenswood and the broader region. Children eventually arrived to bless their marriage, and Elena found herself telling them, as they grew old enough to understand, an age-appropriate version of the story that had brought their parents together, emphasizing always the importance of courage, honesty, and the willingness to pursue difficult truths, even when comfortable silence might have seemed easier. She hoped that lesson would carry forward through generations, a living legacy far more valuable than any territorial dispute or inherited grievance that had once defined the relationship between their two peoples. Cale visited often throughout the following years, his own leadership of Ravenswood strengthening alongside the genuine friendship he maintained with Damien, their combined efforts ensuring that the peace built from such painful revelation continued deepening rather than fading with time. Fiona eventually settled permanently near the border between the two territories, establishing a small trading post that served both packs equally, a physical symbol of the connection now flourishing where suspicion and manufactured hostility had once reigned supreme. And so the story that began with a desperate flight from an unfinished wedding ceremony, driven by fear and an anonymous warning left beneath a pillow, ultimately concluded not simply with justice served for a murdered queen, but with the foundation for lasting peace between two peoples who had suffered needlessly under manufactured conflict for generations, proof that even the deepest inherited hostilities could be transformed through courage, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to truth, regardless of how frightening that pursuit might initially seem to those brave enough to undertake it. The formal alliance between Blackthorn and Ravenswood eventually grew into something the surrounding territories began to reference as a model worth studying. Smaller packs, scattered throughout the wider region, sending representatives to observe how two peoples, with such a long history of manufactured conflict, had managed to build genuine, lasting cooperation within just a few short years. Damien and Cale found themselves hosting visiting delegations with increasing frequency, sharing the practical steps that had guided their own reconciliation, while acknowledging honestly the painful process that had first been required to expose the truth underlying their previous hostility. Elena took particular pride in these visits, often serving as the one who explained the historical research methods that had first uncovered Roran's manipulations, encouraging other packs to examine their own inherited conflicts with similar scrutiny, rather than accepting inherited grievances at face value without question. She established a small program within Blackthorn's archive specifically dedicated to training researchers from allied packs in careful historical investigation, hoping to prevent other communities from suffering under similarly manufactured hostility without ever recognizing its true source. One particularly memorable visit came from a delegation representing a smaller pack situated along the Western Mountains, whose alpha had heard rumors of Blackthorn and Ravenswood's transformation, and traveled personally to understand whether similar reconciliation might be possible for a decades-old conflict, plaguing his own territory's relationship with a neighboring pack. Damien and Kale spent several days walking the young alpha through their own experience, careful to emphasize that genuine peace required patience, consistent effort, and above all, complete honesty about uncomfortable truths that might otherwise remain conveniently buried. The hardest part, Damien told him during one such conversation, wasn't confronting the enemy pack across the border. It was confronting the betrayal within my own ranks, someone I had trusted completely, someone whose deception had shaped years of unnecessary suffering on both sides of a conflict he had personally manufactured. Peace between packs often requires that kind of painful internal reckoning before external reconciliation becomes possible. The young alpha returned to his own territory some weeks later, inspired to begin his own careful investigation into the roots of his pack's inherited conflict, and word eventually reached Blackthorn that his efforts had uncovered similar patterns of manipulation, though on a smaller scale than what Roran had orchestrated. The ripple effects of Elena's original courage, it seemed, continued spreading outward in ways neither she nor Damien could have anticipated when they first began their desperate search for truth so many years earlier. As their children grew older, Elena found herself watching them play together with young wolves from Ravenswood during the regular gatherings both packs now organized throughout the year, celebrations that marked the changing seasons and strengthened bonds between communities that had once viewed each other with inherited suspicion. Watching her own children form genuine friendships across what had once been an impenetrable border filled her with a quiet, profound satisfaction that made every terrifying moment of that original flight through the forest feel entirely worthwhile. On the anniversary of their second wedding each year, Damien and Elena returned to the same stretch of riverbank where the formal peace agreement had first been signed, a quiet tradition they maintained privately, away from the larger celebrations, simply to reflect on the distance both their relationship and their two peoples had traveled since that pivotal moment. Standing together at the water's edge, watching the current move steadily toward the sea, Elena often thought about how differently everything might have unfolded had she chosen fear over courage that first terrifying night, had she simply returned to the altar without ever asking the question that changed everything. "No regrets," she would say quietly each year, echoing the words she had first spoken on their actual wedding day, and Damien would draw her close, grateful beyond measure for a partner brave enough to pursue uncomfortable truth, even when comfortable silence might have seemed so much easier, grateful for a love built on complete honesty rather than convenient ignorance, and grateful for the unlikely peace between two peoples that had emerged from the darkest chapter of his own family's history, transformed through courage into something that would benefit generations of wolves on both sides of a border that no longer divided, but instead connected two communities finally at peace, with both their shared past and their shared future.